The daughters of Cain were never supposed to exist. Born from the world's first murderer, this cursed bloodline carried within them a darkness that would corrupt everything they touched. While most Bible stories focus on the righteous lineages, today we're uncovering the complete saga of the lineage that God allowed to rise, only to watch it destroy itself from within. What made these women so dangerous that their very existence threatened the future of humanity? What secrets did they carry that have been hidden in the shadows of Scripture for thousands of years? Prepare yourself for a journey through the darkest chapters of biblical history. This is the entire story of the daughters of Cain. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? In the quiet shadows of ancient memory lies a story rarely told. Behind the well-known tales of Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, and David's triumph whispers another saga, one of exile and beauty, of cities built in defiance and daughters born into darkness. This is the story of Cain's bloodline, the lineage that fell. Most know Cain as history's first murderer, the brother who killed Abel in a field outside Eden, but few ask what happened next. Where did he go? Who did he love? What children did he raise? The Bible gives us glimpses, but tradition fills the gaps with wonder and terror. Cain's descendants built the first city. They forged the first tools. They played the first songs. Yet their legacy carries a curse that echoes through time. Their daughters were said to be the most beautiful women who ever lived, so beautiful that angels abandoned heaven to be with them, so alluring that they brought about the end of the world. This forgotten lineage shaped civilization itself. They gave us music and metal work, agriculture and architecture, but they also gave us violence and pride. Their story is one of brilliant light casting the deepest shadows. In the land of Nod, east of Eden, Cain's children multiplied. They thrived. They created wonders that made even God take notice. But their success came at a price. With each generation, they moved further from the garden, further from grace, until the very ground cried out for justice. The daughters of this line were legendary: Ada the gentle, Zillah the fierce, Naamah the enchanting. Their names appear briefly in Scripture, but their influence shaped nations. Kings sought their favor. Warriors fought for their love. Angels fell for their beauty. Yet for all their glory, they were children of the cursed, born into a family marked by divine judgment, raised in cities built on bloodshed. Their story begins with exile and ends in floodwaters. But between those moments lies a tale of wonder, corruption, and the dangerous allure of forbidden knowledge. The Bible speaks of giants in those days, the Nephilim, born from the union of heavenly beings and earthly women. These were the sons and daughters of Cain's line mixed with divine power. They became legends themselves, mighty men of old, heroes of renown, but also harbingers of humanity's darkest hour. This is their story, the complete saga of the lineage that fell, from Cain's first steps into exile to the rising waters that washed away his legacy. We'll walk through their cities, meet their children, witness their rise and their ruin. Some tales will comfort, others will disturb. All will reveal truths about the nature of power, beauty, and the price of turning away from the light. Come then, let us journey east of Eden, into the land where the first exile built his kingdom, where daughters sang songs that made angels weep, where the seeds of the world's first end were planted in soil watered by a brother's blood. The first exile, Cain's curse. The blood still stained his hands when God called his name. Cain stood in that field where Abel's life had ended, his brother's sacrifice accepted while his own lay rejected. The rage that had consumed him now gave way to something else: fear. Cold, creeping fear that wrapped around his heart like morning mist. "Where is Abel, your brother?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, gentle yet terrible. Cain had heard this voice before, in the garden when God walked in the cool of the day, but now it carried weight that pressed down on his shoulders. Cain's answer came quickly, too quickly. "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" The words fell flat in the stillness. He knew God saw everything, knew everything. Yet still he lied. Still he tried to hide behind defiance what guilt had already revealed. The earth beneath his feet seemed to pulse, to whisper. God heard its testimony. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries to me from the ground." The words cut deeper than any blade. They reached past Cain's anger into the hollow place where his soul used to sing. The curse came swift and sure. The ground that had drunk Abel's blood would yield nothing for Cain. No matter how hard he worked, how carefully he tended, the earth would mock his efforts. He would be a wanderer, a fugitive. Never again would he know the comfort of home or harvest. Terror seized him then, not the quick fear of a moment, but the deep dread of a man who sees his future stretching endlessly before him. "My punishment is too great to bear," he cried. "You drive me today from the face of the ground. From your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me." But even in judgment, mercy flickered. God placed a mark upon Cain, not a brand of shame, as many suppose, but a sign of protection. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. The mark would shield him from human revenge, though it could not shield him from his own heart. Cain gathered what little he could carry, his tools, some grain, a water skin. The altar where he had offered his rejected sacrifice stood empty now, stones scattered by his rage. He would not rebuild it, could not rebuild it. The God who had favored Abel's offering had no place in the life he would now build. He walked eastward as the sun climbed higher. Each step took him further from Eden's distant glow, further from the place where his parents still tended their smaller garden and grieved for both their sons. One dead, one as good as dead, lost to the wilderness beyond God's presence. The land of Nod stretched before him. Nod, which means wandering. How fitting that his exile should lead him to a place named for restlessness itself. Here he would build his new life. Here his children would grow. Here his daughters would be born into a world where God's voice was only an echo. As night fell on his first day of exile, Cain made camp beside a small stream. The water tasted bitter, or perhaps the bitterness came from within. He stared up at stars that seemed dimmer than he remembered, more distant, as if they too had turned their faces away. In the darkness, he began to plan. If God would not bless his work, he would force blessing from the earth through clever hands and stubborn will. If he could not be a faithful son, he would be a powerful father. His children would never bow to a God who played favorites. They would make their own way, create their own destiny. The mark on his forehead pulsed with warmth. Protection, yes, but also separation. He was marked now as other, as apart. His children would carry that otherness in their blood. They would be beautiful and terrible, gifted and cursed, forever walking the line between creation and destruction. Morning brought no comfort, only the need to keep moving. But as Cain packed his few belongings, something had changed. The despair of the previous day had hardened into resolve. He would not merely survive his exile, he would thrive. And perhaps in time, God would see that he had chosen the wrong brother after all. The city of Enoch, the birth of a civilization. The land of Nod welcomed Cain with silence. No birds sang in its sparse trees, no flowers bloomed along its dusty paths. It was a place for beginnings, though not the kind most would choose. Here, where the earth itself seemed to hold its breath, the world's first city would rise. Cain walked for days before he found the spot, a valley where two streams met, creating a delta rich with possibility. The soil looked different here. Not the deep black loam of Eden, but something workable, something that might, with enough effort, yield enough to sustain life. He built his first shelter quickly, 4 walls of stone and mud brick, a roof of woven reeds. Nothing grand, but solid enough to keep out wind and rain. As he worked, his hands remembered skills learned in Eden, how to fit stones together, how to make mortar that would hold. His parents had taught him well, even if their God had not. Soon, others joined him, wanderers like himself, outcasts and exiles who had heard whispers of a man building something new in the eastern wilderness. They came slowly at first, a hunter here, a shepherd there, people carrying their own griefs and secrets, people who asked no questions about the mark that gleamed on their leader's brow. The settlement grew. What began as a handful of huts became a proper village. Trade routes developed as caravans learned they could find food and shelter in the valley. Craftsmen arrived, drawn by stories of a place where skills mattered more than bloodlines, where the past could be forgotten in favor of what one could build with their own hands. When his first child was born, Cain named him Enoch. The name meant dedicated or initiated. Here was a fresh start, a chance to do better, to be better. The boy would never know the garden's shadow or hear God's voice in the evening breeze. He would be a citizen of this new world his father was creating. As Enoch grew, so did the settlement around him. Cain made a decision that would echo through history. This would not remain a village, it would become something greater, something the world had never seen. He would build the first city and name it for his son. The construction project consumed years. Every resident contributed labor. They quarried stone from nearby hills, fired bricks in kilns that burned day and night, dug foundations deeper than any building had ever required. This city would last. It would stand as proof that humans could create something beautiful without divine blessing or guidance. Streets took shape in careful patterns. Houses rose in orderly rows. A central square provided space for markets and gatherings. Walls surrounded it all, thick enough to turn back any attack. At the city's heart, Cain built his own palace. Not from pride, though pride played its part, but as a symbol, a declaration that here, in this place, human will could shape the world. The city of Enoch became a marvel. Travelers carried tales of its wonders to distant lands. Its organized streets, its thriving markets, its workshops where craftsmen produced goods finer than any seen before. Trade flowed through its gates like water through a channel. Wealth accumulated in its treasuries. Knowledge gathered in its halls. Yet something was missing. In all their building and planning, in all their innovation and success, the citizens of Enoch had created everything except meaning. Their city had no temple. Their lives had no center beyond the pursuit of comfort and gain. They had turned their backs on the God who had driven Cain into exile, but they had found nothing to take his place. Cain noticed this emptiness most clearly in the evening hours. When the day's work was done and the city settled into quietness, he would walk its streets and feel the hollow echo of his own footsteps. They had built something magnificent, but magnificent for what purpose? To what end? The answer came to him slowly. If they could not find meaning in worship, they would find it in achievement. If God would not bless their works, they would create works so grand that blessing became irrelevant. They would become like gods themselves, makers, shapers, masters of their own destiny. This vision would guide everything that followed, the marriages Cain arranged, the children he raised, the technologies his people developed. The city of Enoch would be more than a place to live. It would be humanity's first great experiment in divine independence, a test of what mortals could accomplish when freed from heavenly oversight. The test was about to begin. The sons and daughters of Cain, a shadowed line. In the prosperous years that followed Enoch's founding, Cain's family grew like a tree spreading its branches toward the sun. Yet this tree was rooted in cursed ground, and its fruit would prove both sweet and bitter. His children were born into privilege, but also into shadow. They inherited their father's gifts for creation and his burden of separation from the divine. Enoch, the firstborn, grew into a man of quiet wisdom. He shared his father's vision for the city, but tempered it with patience and careful thought. Under his guidance, the settlement evolved from rough frontier town to sophisticated center of learning. Scholars came to study in its libraries. Artists came to perfect their crafts in its workshops. The city that bore his name became synonymous with human achievement. But Enoch also inherited something else from his father, a restlessness that no achievement could fully satisfy, a hunger that no feast could fill. He walked the city streets at night, searching for something he could never quite name. His children would inherit this same yearning, this sense of incompleteness that drove them to ever greater heights and ever deeper darkness. As the family line expanded, certain traits became clear. Cain's descendants were marked by exceptional ability. They learned quickly, created effortlessly, led naturally. But they were also proud beyond measure and quick to anger when challenged. They loved beauty with desperate intensity. They pursued knowledge with dangerous passion. They wielded power with increasing ruthlessness. The women of this line were particularly noteworthy. They possessed a beauty that stopped conversations and changed the course of kingdoms. More than physical attractiveness, they radiated a quality that drew others like moths to flame. It was as if the divine spark that their ancestor had rejected had been transformed into something purely earthly, yet no less compelling. Ada emerged as the first of these legendary daughters. Her name meant ornament or beauty, and she lived up to both meanings. Tall and graceful, with dark hair that caught light like water, and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She moved through the city like music made visible. Men wrote poetry about her smile. Women copied her manner of dress. Children followed her through the streets, enchanted by her gentle voice and easy laughter. Yet beneath Ada's soft exterior lay steel. She understood power in ways that surprised even her male relatives. While others debated policy in council chambers, she shaped opinion in markets and homes. She knew which whispered words could end careers and which gentle suggestions could launch them. Her influence spread through the city like morning mist, invisible but everywhere. Zillah presented a different kind of beauty. Where Ada was gentle water, Zillah was bright fire. Her red hair blazed like sunset. Her green eyes flashed with intelligence and challenge. She spoke her mind without apology and defended her positions with razor wit. Men found her intimidating and irresistible in equal measure. She cared nothing for their comfort. While Ada worked behind scenes, Zillah operated in full view. She attended council meetings uninvited and spoke her opinions whether asked or not. She challenged traditions that restricted women's roles and created new paths for herself when old ones proved inadequate. Her bold example inspired other women to question their limitations. But perhaps the most remarkable daughter was Naamah, whose name meant pleasant or lovely. She combined her sister's qualities while adding something uniquely her own. Beautiful like Ada, strong like Zillah, but also touched with an otherworldly quality that made people wonder if she was entirely human. Nama could sing in ways that made grown men weep. She could dance movements that seemed to defy natural law. When she spoke, her words carried weight beyond their meaning. Plants bloomed more fully in her presence. Animals grew calm under her touch. Some whispered that she possessed knowledge forbidden to mortals. Others claimed she could speak with spirits that dwelt between earth and heaven. The sons of Cain's line were equally gifted, though their talents took different forms. They became the world's first specialists. One mastered the art of working with animals. Another created music that had never been heard before. A third discovered secrets of metalwork that transformed tools and weapons. These children grew up in a city that celebrated human achievement above all else. They learned that problems existed to be solved, that limitations existed to be overcome, that rules existed to be improved upon. They absorbed the lesson that sufficiently applied intelligence could master any challenge. This confidence would serve them well. It would also destroy them. Family gatherings in those days must have been remarkable affairs, the halls filled with music and laughter, tables groaning under exotic foods brought by trade caravans. Conversations sparking with new ideas and bold plans. Children playing games that prepared them for futures filled with possibility. Yet even in celebration, shadows lingered. Toasts were raised with wine, but they honored human achievement rather than divine blessing. Songs were sung of great deeds, but never of worship or humility. Stories were told of heroes who conquered through strength and cunning, not through faith or sacrifice. The children of Cain were being prepared for greatness, but greatness of what kind, and at what cost? These questions would soon demand answers. The three sons, Jabal, Jubal, Tubal-Cain. Among the sons born to Cain's lineage, three would leave marks on history that time itself could not erase. Brothers born to Lamech, they would become fathers of entire professions. Their names would be remembered long after their city crumbled and their bloodline ended. They were Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain. The world has never been the same since they drew breath. Jabal was the eldest, a boy whose eyes always turned toward distant horizons. While other children played in the city streets, he wandered the countryside beyond Enoch's walls. He studied how wild animals moved across the landscape, watched how they found water and shelter, learned which plants they ate and which they avoided. His family thought him odd. This son who preferred fields to buildings, silence to conversation. But Jabal saw possibilities where others saw only wilderness. The land beyond the city could feed more than just its current inhabitants. Animals could be gathered and guided rather than simply hunted. Crops could be planted in patterns that yielded more food from less ground. He began experimenting with these ideas during his teenage years, much to his father's bewilderment. His breakthrough came during a particularly harsh winter. Food stores in the city ran low. Hunting parties returned empty handed day after day. Merchants stopped coming because the roads were impassable. People began to wonder if they would starve before spring returned. But Jabal had prepared. His small herd of captured goats provided milk and meat. His stored grains fed dozens of families. His methods saved the city. From that moment, everything changed. Young men sought him out, eager to learn his techniques. Families sent their children to work in his fields and tend his animals. What had begun as one boy's strange hobby became a profession that would employ thousands. Jabal became known as the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. The nomadic life was born. His younger brother Jubal took a different path to immortality. Where Jabal found music in the wind across grasslands, Jubal heard melodies in everything: the rhythm of hammers in workshops, the harmony of voices in the marketplace, the percussion of rain on rooftops. For him, the entire world was an instrument waiting to be played. Jubal's first creation was simple: a hollow reed with holes carved along its length. When he breathed into it, sounds emerged unlike anything heard before. Not the random noises of nature, but controlled tones that could be shaped and combined. He experimented endlessly, creating different sizes and shapes. Each produced its own voice. Together, they could speak in harmonies that made listeners forget their troubles. Word of his musical instruments spread quickly through the city. Soon, everyone wanted to try these wonderful devices. Jubal began teaching others how to make and play them. He developed the first systematic approach to music education. Students learned scales and rhythms. They practiced together in groups, creating sounds more complex than any individual could produce alone. But Jubal's greatest achievement was the harp. After years of perfecting wind instruments, he turned his attention to strings. He crafted a wooden frame strong enough to support multiple chords under tension. When plucked, these strings produced pure tones that could be combined in countless ways. The harp became his masterpiece, an instrument capable of expressing every human emotion. Music transformed the city. Evening gatherings featured concerts that drew crowds from across the region. Religious ceremonies, though they honored human rather than divine achievement, gained new power through song. Workers sang rhythmic chants that made their labor more efficient. Children learned lessons through melodies that helped them remember. Jubal became known as the father of all who play the harp and flute. The youngest brother, Tubal-Cain, surpassed them both in practical impact. His domain was metal, fire, and forge. The transformation of raw ore into tools that could reshape the world. He began with copper, learning to extract pure metal from rocky ore through intense heat and careful technique. But copper was soft, useful for ornaments and simple tools, but inadequate for serious work. Tubal-Cain's genius lay in experimentation. He tried mixing different metals together, heating them to various temperatures, cooling them at different rates. Most attempts failed, but each failure taught him something new about how metals behaved. Slowly, through countless trials, he discovered the secrets of bronze. Copper mixed with tin created an alloy harder than either metal alone. Bronze tools revolutionized everything. Farmers could clear land more efficiently with bronze plows. Builders could shape stone more precisely with bronze chisels. Warriors could fight more effectively with bronze weapons. The city's expansion accelerated dramatically as bronze tools made previously impossible projects suddenly feasible. But Tubal-Cain wasn't finished. His masterwork came later when he learned to work with iron. This metal required higher temperatures and more complex techniques. It was harder to extract and more difficult to shape. But iron tools were stronger than bronze, held sharper edges longer, and could accomplish tasks beyond any previous technology. The Bible records that Tubal-Cain became the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. Every blacksmith who has ever lived learned techniques he pioneered. Every metal tool traces its ancestry back to his innovations. He gave humanity the power to reshape the natural world on an unprecedented scale. Together, these three brothers transformed civilization. Jabal taught humans to work with nature rather than against it. Jubal gave them music to express their hearts and bond their communities. Tubal-Cain provided tools to build whatever their minds could imagine. They were the original Renaissance men, masters of the arts that make human culture possible. Yet their gifts came with a price. The same abilities that enriched human life also increased human power. And power, in the hands of those who had turned away from divine guidance, would prove dangerous indeed. The sons of Lamech had given their people the means to build a civilization. Whether that civilization would be a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. Naamah, the first daughter of Cain. Of all the daughters born to Cain's lineage, none captured imagination like Naamah. Her very name, meaning pleasant or lovely, seemed insufficient to contain the mystery that surrounded her. She was beautiful, yes, but beauty was common among the women of her line. Naamah possessed something more, something that made even angels pause in their heavenly circuits to look upon the earth. She entered the world during a thunderstorm that shook the city of Enoch to its foundations. Lightning split the sky in patterns that some claimed formed words in languages no human could read. The midwives who attended her birth whispered of signs and wonders, how the child emerged without crying, her eyes already open and aware. How candles flickered in rhythms that matched her breathing, how the storm calmed the moment she drew her first breath. Naamah's childhood was marked by incidents that parents explained away but never forgot. Plants grew larger in gardens where she played. Sick animals recovered after she petted them. Music boxes played melodies they had never been wound to produce when she passed nearby. Her siblings learned not to lie to her because she always seemed to know the truth. Her parents learned not to make promises they couldn't keep because she never forgot anything. As she grew, so did the stories. Traders spoke of seeing her in the marketplace, examining goods with knowledge that surprised even experienced merchants. She could tell which spices came from which distant lands by their scent alone. She knew which fabrics would hold dye best before the weavers tested them. She selected the finest oils and perfumes with an expertise that baffled their creators. But Naamah's true gifts revealed themselves in music and dance. When Jubal created new instruments, she was often the first to master them. Her voice could reach notes that strained the upper limits of human hearing, then drop to tones so deep they seemed to resonate in the earth itself. She sang in languages that sounded familiar, but used words no one recognized. Listeners found themselves understanding the meaning without comprehending the words. Her dancing was even more remarkable. She moved with a grace that seemed to defy the normal limitations of human anatomy. Her body flowed like water, like wind, like flame itself. When she danced at festivals, crowds gathered that filled entire plazas. People traveled from neighboring cities just to witness her performances. Some claimed that watching her dance was like seeing the hidden patterns that connected all things. Yet for all her gifts, Naamah remained approachable. She spent time with common folk as easily as with nobles. Children adored her because she listened to their troubles with genuine interest. Elderly people sought her out because she treated their stories with respect. She had a gift for making each person feel as though they were the most important individual in the world. Suitors came from across the known world, drawn by reports of her beauty and accomplishments. Princes offered marriage alliances that would have secured her family's political position for generations. Wealthy merchants promised treasures from distant lands. Scholars brought gifts of rare books and ancient wisdom. Artists created masterpieces in her honor. Naamah received these offerings graciously, but accepted none of them. She seemed to be waiting for something, though she never explained what. When pressed by family members about marriage, she would only smile and say that the right time had not yet come. Some interpreted this as vanity or impossible standards. Others sensed that she was following guidance from sources they could not perceive. Her influence extended far beyond personal relationships. Naamah became an informal advisor to the city's leaders. Her insights into human nature helped resolve disputes that had seemed impossible to settle. Her suggestions for improving trade relationships opened new markets for the city's goods. Her recommendations for urban planning enhanced both the beauty and efficiency of Enoch's continued expansion. But perhaps most significantly, Naamah began to attract attention from beyond the human realm. Travelers brought strange reports. Stars had been seen moving in unusual patterns. Animals gathered in configurations that formed no natural purpose. The weather itself seemed to shift in response to her presence. Clear skies would suddenly fill with clouds when she felt sad. Gentle breezes would spring up when she laughed. The priests of neighboring cities, those who still maintained temples to ancient gods, sent emissaries to observe her. They returned with tales that their masters found difficult to believe. This daughter of the cursed line seemed to possess abilities that rivaled those of divine beings. She was mortal, certainly, but somehow more than mortal, as if the very force of life itself flowed more strongly through her than through others. These reports eventually reached beyond earthly shores. In the heavenly realms, beings of light and power began to take notice of Nama. They watched her with growing fascination. Her beauty was remarkable, but it was her otherworldly nature that truly captured their attention. She seemed like a bridge between realms, a creature who belonged fully to neither heaven nor earth, but somehow to both. This celestial interest would prove fateful. For when beings of pure spirit become fascinated with creatures of flesh and blood, the consequences touch both realms. The stage was being set for unions that would shake the foundations of the world. And at the center of it all stood Nama, lovely and mysterious, waiting for whatever destiny had in store. The time of waiting was almost over. The Watchers descend, forbidden unions. In the high places of heaven, rebellion was stirring. Among the host of angels, a group known as Watchers had been assigned to observe humanity from afar. They were to watch and report, never to interfere, never to make themselves known, never to descend below the crystalline dome that separated the celestial realm from the earthly one. For countless eons, they had fulfilled this duty faithfully. But now, something had changed. The change began subtly. Where once the Watchers had looked upon humanity with detached interest, they now found themselves drawn to specific individuals. The daughters of Cain's line possessed a beauty that transcended mere physical appearance. There was something about them that called to the angelic nature, a quality that made the Watchers lean forward in their observation, straining against the boundaries of their assigned roles. Azazel was the first to speak the thought that had been growing in all their minds. He was their leader, the most beautiful and powerful among them. His voice carried the authority of countless years of faithful service. "Why should we be content to watch?" he asked during one of their gatherings. "We are mighty beings, created with power and wisdom, yet we are forbidden to use our gifts to help these struggling creatures below." His words found fertile ground in hearts already prepared for rebellion. Semjaza, second in authority, nodded slowly. "They stumble in darkness while we possess light. They suffer from ignorance while we hold knowledge. Is it not cruel to withhold what we could so easily provide?" The debate that followed would have consequences beyond anything they could imagine. These beings, created to serve and worship, were discovering the intoxicating taste of independent thought. They began to see their restrictions not as divine wisdom, but as arbitrary limitations. Their assigned roles not as honored positions, but as prisons that kept them from their true potential. As they watched the daughters of men go about their daily lives, the Watchers found themselves focusing on individual faces and forms. They learned names and personalities. They observed private moments and personal struggles. What had begun as general observation became intimate attention. And with that intimacy came desire. The women of Cain's line seemed almost designed to attract such notice. Nama, in particular, possessed qualities that the Watchers found irresistible. When she danced, her movements seemed to echo the cosmic patterns that govern the motion of stars. When she sang, her voice carried harmonies that reminded them of the music of the spheres. She was earthbound, yet somehow familiar, as if she carried within her flesh some fragment of the celestial realm they called home. The temptation grew stronger with each passing day. The Watchers began to imagine what it would be like to walk among humans, to feel soil beneath their feet instead of clouds, to experience the warmth of sunlight on their skin rather than the cool radiance of eternal glory, to hold these beautiful women in their arms and share with them the secrets of heaven. Azazel finally voiced what they all were thinking. We could teach them so much, show them wonders beyond their current understanding, guide them toward achievements that would benefit all mankind. Surely this would be a greater service than merely watching from afar. The rationalization was seductive. They convinced themselves that their desire to descend was really a desire to help, that their fascination with these women was actually compassion for their limited understanding, that their willingness to break divine command was really a higher form of obedience to divine love. One by one, they made their choice. 200 of the Watchers gathered on Mount Hermon and swore an oath of mutual support. They would descend together. They would take wives from among the daughters of men. They would share their knowledge and power with humanity, and they would accept whatever consequences came from their decision. The oath they swore was binding and terrible. Each Watcher called down curses upon himself should he fail to support the others in their rebellion. They knew they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But the attraction below was stronger than the fear of punishment above. The descent began at sunset on a night when the veil between worlds was thinnest. One by one, the Watchers left their positions in the heavenly court. They passed through the crystalline dome that had always marked the limit of their world. They felt the strange pull of earthly gravity drawing them downward toward the realm of flesh and blood. As they descended, their forms began to change. The pure light of their celestial bodies dimmed and solidified. They took on shapes that could walk on solid ground and breathe earthly air. Yet they retained much of their supernatural power and knowledge. They were no longer fully angelic, but they were far more than human. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Animals fled in terror from their presence. Plants withered under the weight of divine power in earthly form. The very air seemed to thicken and shimmer around them. Those humans sensitive to spiritual forces felt a disturbance that made them uneasy without knowing why. But for the daughters of Cain's line, the effect was different. These women, already touched by otherworldly beauty and mysterious gifts, found themselves drawn to the newcomers. There was something familiar about these strange men, something that called to the celestial spark hidden deep within their earthly forms. The Watchers dispersed across the land, but many were drawn to the city of Enoch. Here lived the most beautiful and gifted of human women. Here was the center of human learning and achievement. Here was where their rebellion would bear its most dramatic fruit. As they walked through the city streets for the first time, the Watchers marveled at what humans had accomplished. The buildings, the art, the music, the complex social structures. These creatures were more remarkable than they had realized from their distant observation. Perhaps their decision to descend had been wise after all. But they also saw the emptiness at the heart of human civilization, the spiritual void left by Cain's rejection of divine guidance, the hunger for meaning that no earthly achievement could satisfy. They began to believe that they could fill this void, that their presence could provide what was missing. The stage was set for the most fateful unions in human history. When the sons of God took wives from among the daughters of men, the consequences would reshape the world. The time of watching was over. The time of forbidden intimacy was about to begin. The intermingling sons of God and daughters of men. The first meetings were electric with possibility. When Azazel encountered Nama in the gardens outside Enoch, both recognized something profound in the other. She saw in him a being of impossible beauty and wisdom, whose very presence made the air shimmer with power. He saw in her a creature whose earthly form contained mysteries that rivaled the secrets of heaven itself. Their courtship, if it could be called that, unfolded like nothing the world had ever seen. Azazel shared with her knowledge that had been hidden since the foundation of the world. He taught her the names of stars and their influences on earthly affairs. He revealed the properties of plants and stones that could heal or harm. He showed her how to read the patterns of weather and predict the future from the flight of birds. Nama absorbed these teachings with a hunger that surprised even her celestial suitor. She seemed to understand concepts that should have taken years to master. Her questions revealed insights that challenged even his ancient wisdom. Together, they explored realms of knowledge that had never been accessible to purely human or purely angelic minds. But knowledge was not the only thing they shared. The attraction between them was undeniable and overwhelming. When Azazel took her as his wife, the union released forces that rippled through both the earthly and heavenly realms. The earth itself seemed to pulse with new energy. The sky flickered with lights that had never been seen before. Their wedding night brought wonders and terrors in equal measure. Trees bloomed out of season, rivers changed their courses, mountains trembled as if the very foundations of the world were shifting. Some who witnessed these signs rejoiced, believing they marked the dawn of a new age. Others fled in terror, sensing that something fundamental about reality had been broken. Across the region, similar unions were taking place. Simjaza chose Ada for his bride, drawn to her gentle strength and hidden steel. Her beauty was softer than Nama's otherworldly allure, but no less compelling. When they joined together, fields of grain grew overnight to impossible heights. Flowers bloomed that had never been seen before, their colors so vivid they seemed to glow with inner light. Zillah attracted Barakiel, a watcher whose domain was lightning and storm. Her fiery nature matched his own tempestuous power. Their union brought rains that lasted for days, filling reservoirs and transforming the landscape. But the rain carried a strange quality. Those who drank it found their senses sharpened and their minds quickened. Some claimed they could suddenly understand languages they had never learned. The pattern spread as more watchers took wives from among the daughters of men. Each union brought its own marvels: rivers that flowed upward, stones that sang when the wind touched them, animals that spoke in human tongues. The natural order, established since creation, began to bend and blur under the weight of these impossible relationships. The women who married the Watchers found themselves changed by the experience. Their already remarkable beauty became almost painful to look upon. Their voices gained power to heal or harm with their words alone. They aged more slowly than other humans, as if their celestial husbands' immortality had rubbed off on them. Some developed abilities that bordered on the magical. They could see events happening in distant places. They could speak with the spirits of the dead. But perhaps the most significant change was in their children. When unions between divine and human produced offspring, the results defied every natural law. These children grew at impossible rates, reaching adult size while still possessing the minds of infants. They possessed strength that could break stone with bare hands. Their intelligence developed along lines that seemed almost alien to normal human thought. The first of these hybrid children caused wonder and terror in equal measure. They were beautiful beyond description, but their beauty carried a quality that made mortals uneasy. They learned to speak in complete sentences before they could properly walk. They solved mathematical problems that challenged the greatest scholars. They displayed artistic abilities that produced works of breathtaking perfection. Yet, there was something wrong with them as well. They showed little capacity for normal human emotions. Love, compassion, and mercy seemed foreign concepts to them. They treated other humans with the casual indifference that humans might show to insects. When they played together, their games often ended in violence that left ordinary children seriously injured. As these hybrid children grew, they began to be called by a name that would echo through history: Nephilim, the fallen ones, or perhaps the ones who cause others to fall. Their very existence challenged everything that humans thought they knew about the world and their place in it. The Watchers, intoxicated by their new lives as husbands and fathers, began to share even more forbidden knowledge with their wives and children. Azazel taught the secrets of metalworking that made Tubal-Cain's innovations seem primitive. Weapons appeared that could cut through any armor. Tools emerged that could reshape landscapes with minimal effort. Semjaza revealed the mysteries of agriculture that went far beyond Jabal's discoveries. Crops could be made to grow in any soil, in any season, with yields that seemed impossible. But these enhanced plants required careful handling. Some developed properties that were beneficial in small doses but deadly in larger amounts. Other Watchers shared different secrets: the art of making cosmetics that could enhance beauty to supernatural levels, the craft of creating jewelry that granted the wearer unusual abilities, the knowledge of medicines that could extend life or end it with equal effectiveness. Each gift came with both blessings and curses. The city of Enoch became a center of wonders that drew visitors from across the known world. Its markets offered goods that seemed to come from dreams rather than earthly workshops. Its schools taught subjects that had never been studied before. Its artists created works that moved viewers to tears or ecstasy without apparent reason. But underneath the marvels, corruption was growing. The hybrid children, now reaching maturity, began to assert themselves in ways that disturbed even their celestial fathers. They demanded tribute from purely human populations. They took whatever they wanted without regard for ownership or consent. They treated the earth itself as their personal possession. The daughters of Cain's line, now mothers to these strange beings, found themselves caught between worlds. They loved their children but feared what they were becoming. They treasured their celestial husbands but worried about the price of their rebellion. They enjoyed their enhanced abilities but sensed that something precious was being lost in the process. In the heavenly realms, the consequences of the Watchers' rebellion were becoming clear. The ordered cosmos that had existed since creation was beginning to fracture. The careful balance between spiritual and material realms was being destroyed by these unauthorized unions. Divine justice demanded a response. But for now, in the cities and fields where the Nephilim played and the daughters of men bore impossible children, the immediate future seemed bright with promise. None could foresee the storm that was gathering in the heights of heaven. None imagined that their moment of triumph would soon become the prelude to history's greatest catastrophe. The age of giants had begun. The age of judgment was soon to follow. Lamech, the violent line, continues. In the 6th generation from Cain came a man whose name would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Lamech inherited his ancestors' pride and multiplied it sevenfold. Where Cain had killed in a moment of rage, Lamech made violence into an art form. Where Cain had shown remorse for his crime, Lamech boasted of his brutality. The curse that began with a brother's blood in a field would find its fullest expression in this descendant who turned murder into a way of life. Lamech grew up in prosperity that his forefathers could never have imagined. The city of Enoch had expanded into a trading empire that stretched across the known world. Caravans brought wealth from distant lands. Craftsmen produced goods that commanded premium prices in foreign markets. The techniques developed by Jubal and Tubal-Cain had created industries that employed thousands and generated enormous profits. But wealth without wisdom breeds corruption. Lamech came of age in a culture that measured worth by possessions and power by the ability to take what one wanted from others. He learned early that strength mattered more than justice. That cleverness counted for more than compassion. That the mark of a successful man was how many people feared him. His education included all the advanced knowledge that the Watchers had shared with their wives and children. He studied mathematics that could predict celestial movements. He learned metallurgy that could create alloys stronger than anything previously known. He mastered agricultural techniques that could coax abundance from the most reluctant soil. But he also absorbed lessons in warfare that made him a master of organized violence. Lamech's first taste of blood came during a border dispute with a neighboring settlement. A disagreement over water rights had escalated into armed conflict. While other young men from Enoch served as common soldiers, Lamech distinguished himself through tactical brilliance and utter ruthlessness. He showed no mercy to defeated enemies. He took no prisoners who might later seek revenge. He left examples that would discourage future challenges to his city's expansion. The victory made him a hero in Enoch, but it also awakened something dark in his nature. He had discovered that he enjoyed killing, not just the practical necessity of eliminating threats, but the actual act of ending human life. The look of fear in his victim's eyes, the feeling of absolute power over life and death, the knowledge that his will could erase another person from existence. His appetite for violence grew with feeding. Lamech began to seek out conflicts rather than wait for them to come to him. He led raids against settlements that had never threatened Enoch. He attacked trading caravans that carried goods his city needed, preferring to take by force what could have been obtained through negotiation. He turned war from a last resort into a primary tool of policy. But Lamech's greatest innovation was in the realm of personal combat. Previous generations had fought with bronze weapons that, while effective, still required considerable skill to use properly. Lamech commissioned Tubal-Cain to create something different, a weapon so efficient that victory would depend more on possessing it than on mastering its use. The result was the first iron sword designed specifically for killing humans. longer than any blade previously forged, sharper than bronze could ever be, perfectly balanced for rapid strikes and devastating cuts. In Lamech's hands, this weapon made him nearly invincible in personal combat. He could defeat multiple opponents armed with traditional weapons. He could cut through bronze armor as if it were cloth. Word of Lamech's prowess spread far beyond Enoch. Warriors came from distant lands to test their skills against him. Most never returned home. Those who survived carried tales of a man who fought with supernatural speed and strength, who seemed to anticipate his opponent's moves before they made them, who killed with a precision that suggested he had been born for no other purpose. But physical dominance was not enough for Lamech. He craved recognition of his superiority in all areas of life. He demanded the finest foods, the most luxurious clothing, the grandest residence in the city. He surrounded himself with servants whose primary job was to remind him hourly of his greatness. He commissioned artists to create works celebrating his victories. He paid poets to compose verses praising his strength and wisdom. His pride reached its peak when he decided that the traditional marriage customs of his people were inadequate for someone of his stature. Where other men took one wife, Lamech would take two, not because he loved two women, but because having two wives would demonstrate his wealth and power. It would show the world that normal rules did not apply to him. This decision would prove more significant than even Lamech realized. His choice of wives would introduce new bloodlines into the descendancy of Cain. The children born from these unions would inherit not only their father's violent nature, but also qualities from their mother's families that would amplify both good and evil in unexpected ways. But perhaps most troubling was Lamech's attitude toward his own violence. Where Cain had tried to hide his crime and had begged for mercy when confronted with his punishment, Lamech celebrated his murders. He composed a song about his killings that he performed at public gatherings. The lyrics boasted of his willingness to kill anyone who offended him, no matter how slight the provocation. In this song, preserved in scripture for posterity, Lamech revealed the depth of his depravity. He sang to his wives about killing a young man for merely wounding him. He bragged about killing a child for simply striking him. He declared that if Cain would be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech would be avenged 77-fold. He had taken his ancestors' curse and turned it into a promise of unlimited retaliation. This public celebration of murder marked a new low in human moral development, where previous generations had at least recognized that taking life was wrong, even when they did it anyway. Lamech made killing into a virtue. He created a culture where violence was not just accepted but admired, where strength justified any action, where the ability to hurt others became the highest measure of personal worth. The effects of Lamech's example rippled through society like poison in a water supply. Young men began to imitate his methods and attitudes. Disputes that would previously have been settled through negotiation or community judgment now ended in bloodshed. The city that had been built as a refuge for outcasts became a predator that consumed its neighbors. Yet even as Lamech celebrated his violence and his wives bore children who would inherit his legacy, forces were gathering that would ultimately humble his pride. The same divine justice that had marked Cain for his crime was taking note of Lamech's boasts. The patience of heaven was not unlimited. A reckoning was coming that would make Lamech's iron sword seem like a child's toy. But for now, he ruled through fear and force, the undisputed master of a civilization that had forgotten the difference between strength and righteousness. His wives would bear children who would shape the final chapters of the pre-flood world. And in those children, the best and worst of human nature would be magnified, magnet all previous measure. The wives of Lamech. Ada and Zillah Lamech's decision to take two wives was not made from love, but from ambition. In a world where power was measured by possessions, wives were the ultimate status symbol. They demonstrated not only wealth, since maintaining multiple households required considerable resources, but also virility and social dominance. For a man who had built his reputation on breaking conventions and exceeding normal limits, traditional monogamy was simply inadequate. His choice of wives revealed his strategic thinking as much as his desires. Ada came from a family renowned for their skill in animal husbandry and agriculture. Her bloodline had perfected the techniques that Jabal had pioneered, creating herds and crops that seemed to thrive under any conditions. Marrying her would give Lamech access to agricultural knowledge that could support his growing territorial ambitions. Ada herself was a woman of quiet strength and practical wisdom. She understood the value of patience and careful planning. Where Lamech saw immediate obstacles to be smashed through violence, she saw long-term challenges that required steady effort to overcome. Her beauty was understated but enduring, the kind that grew more appealing with familiarity rather than striking at first glance. She accepted Lamech's proposal with the same practical calculation he had used in making it. Marriage to the most powerful man in Enoch would secure her family's position and give her children advantages that no other arrangement could provide. She understood his violent nature, but believed she could channel it toward productive ends. Perhaps she could be the civilizing influence that would turn his strength toward building rather than destroying. Zillah represented an entirely different set of attractions and advantages. Her family were master craftsmen who had learned metalworking secrets from the Watchers themselves. They could create alloys that were stronger than pure metals and tools that held their edges longer than any previously known. Their workshops produced weapons and implements that were prized throughout the region. But Zillah brought more than technical knowledge to the marriage. She possessed a fierce intelligence and a will that could match Lamech's own. Where Ada sought to influence him through patience and gentle suggestion, Zillah confronted him directly when she disagreed with his decisions. Their arguments were legendary throughout the city, passionate exchanges that sometimes ended in violence, but more often in grudging mutual respect. Her beauty was bold and demanding, the kind that stopped conversations and changed the direction of men's thoughts. She wore her attractiveness like armor, knowing its power and using it deliberately to achieve her goals. Unlike Ada, who hoped to soften Lamech's nature, Zillah seemed determined to sharpen it into a more effective weapon. The two women could not have been more different in temperament and approach, yet they found ways to coexist within Lamech's household. Perhaps they recognized that their situations were similar enough to create sympathy despite their differences. Both were married to a man whose love was conditional on their usefulness. Both were raising children in a world where violence was becoming the primary solution to every problem. Ada's approach to this challenge was to create pockets of peace within the chaos. Her section of the household became a refuge where children could learn gentleness and servants could work without fear of sudden punishment. She taught her sons to appreciate beauty and her daughters to value wisdom above mere cleverness. Her influence was subtle but persistent, like water wearing away stone. Zillah took a different path. She embraced the reality of their violent world and prepared her children to succeed within it. She taught them to fight with words as well as weapons, to read the intentions hidden behind friendly faces, to strike quickly when threatened and show no mercy to defeated enemies. Her section of the household hummed with energy and ambition. The contrast between the two wives extended to every aspect of their lives. Ada's rooms were decorated with growing things and gentle colors. Plants thrived in her windows. Birds nested under her eaves. Children felt safe in her presence. Her voice was soft and her movements graceful. She seemed to carry an aura of calm that soothed everyone around her. Zillah's apartments blazed with bold colors and dramatic contrasts. Metal sculptures caught and reflected light from polished surfaces. The few plants she kept were chosen for their striking appearance rather than their gentleness. Her voice could cut through any noise when she wanted attention. Her movements were precise and purposeful. Being near her felt like standing close to a controlled fire. Yet both women shared certain qualities that had attracted Lamech in the first place. They were intelligent enough to understand the political complexities of their situation. They were strong enough to maintain their dignity despite being treated as possessions. They were pragmatic enough to work with things they could not change while looking for opportunities to influence outcomes they cared about. Their children would inherit different combinations of these parental traits. Some would favor Ada's gentleness. Others would embrace Zillah's intensity. Still others would combine qualities from both mothers in ways that created entirely new personalities. But all would carry within them the mark of Lamech's violence and the legacy of Cain's curse. The relationship between the two wives evolved over the years from wary rivalry to grudging cooperation to something approaching friendship. They learned to coordinate their influence over Lamech, presenting united fronts when his decisions threatened their children's welfare. They shared information about threats and opportunities that affected the household. They even began to appreciate the different strengths each brought to their common challenges. But perhaps most importantly, they recognized that they were living through a crucial moment in human history. The world around them was changing rapidly as the knowledge of the Watchers spread and the power of the Nephilim grew. Their children would inherit a civilization unlike anything that had existed before. Whether that inheritance would be a blessing or a curse would depend partly on the wisdom they could pass down through the generations. In their private moments, both women sometimes wondered if they had made the right choices. Ada questioned whether her gentle approach was adequate to prepare her children for an increasingly violent world. Zillah worried that her emphasis on strength and cunning might be creating monsters rather than survivors, but they had committed themselves to their paths and their families. All they could do was raise their children as well as they knew how and hope that love would prove stronger than the curses that seemed to follow their bloodline. The stage was set for the final act of the pre-flood drama. The children these women would bear would become the last generation of Cain's line. Their choices would determine whether that lineage would end in glory or catastrophe. The wives of Lamech could not know what was coming, but they would do their best to prepare their families for whatever lay ahead. The corruption spreads, civilization declines. Something dark was growing in the hearts of Cain's people. What began as pride in their cities and crafts slowly twisted into something uglier. The children of the first exile carried their ancestors' restless spirit, but now it had found new ways to express itself. Violence became common in the streets of Enoch. Men settled disputes with bronze weapons forged by Tubal-Cain's students. The music of Jubal's followers turned harsh and wild. What once celebrated life now stirred darker passions. The gentle melodies that had soothed evening gatherings gave way to rhythms that inflamed the blood. Lamech's boastful song about killing a young man had become a popular chant among the warriors. They sang it in taverns, teaching their sons that violence was strength, that mercy was weakness. The mark that protected Cain had twisted in meaning. His descendants believed it made them untouchable, free to do as they pleased. The daughters of this line grew more beautiful with each generation, but their beauty carried a strange power. Men would abandon their wives and families just to glimpse Nama walking through the market. Her sisters were equally captivating. They wore jewels and fine cloth, their hair adorned with gold that caught the light like captured fire. Trade routes brought wealth to the city, but also brought corruption. Merchants told stories of distant lands where people worshipped strange gods, where rituals involved things that would have horrified Adam and Eve. The Cainites listened with fascination rather than fear. They began to adopt these foreign ways, mixing them with their own traditions. Children who should have been learning to tend flocks or work the soil were instead taught to fight and steal. Young women who might have become loving mothers and wives learned instead to use their beauty as a weapon. The family bonds that held society together began to fray. The city's elders no longer gathered to seek wisdom or justice. They met to divide the spoils of raids on smaller settlements. They planned attacks on the peaceful descendants of Seth, jealous of their simple contentment. The blessing of creativity that God had given humanity through Cain's line was being used to devise new forms of cruelty. Marriage became a tool of alliance rather than love. Men took multiple wives not from affection but to display their wealth and power. Women were traded like cattle, their wishes ignored. The sacred bond between husband and wife, which reflected God's love for his people, became twisted into something unrecognizable. Even the children were not safe. Parents who should have protected them instead exposed them to violence and immorality. Young ones learned to lie before they could properly speak. They were taught that taking what you wanted was more important than earning it through honest work. The technology that should have eased human suffering was turned toward conquest. Bronze weapons grew sharper and more deadly. The music that could have lifted spirits toward heaven instead pulled them down toward earth and lower. The cities that could have been havens became prisons of moral decay. Nature itself seemed to rebel against what was happening. Crops failed more often, animals grew skittish around human settlements. The weather became more violent, as if the very sky was angry. But the Cainites interpreted these signs as challenges to overcome, rather than warnings to heed. The corruption spread like poison in water. What had been isolated incidents of violence became daily occurrences. What had been whispered scandals became open boasts. The distinction between right and wrong blurred until many couldn't tell the difference anymore. Some of the older generation remembered better days and wept for what was being lost. But their voices were drowned out by the younger ones who embraced the darkness with enthusiasm. The wisdom of age was scorned as weakness. The innocence of youth was seen as something to be quickly destroyed. This was the world that would soon attract the attention of beings far more dangerous than any human warrior. The stage was being set for corruption beyond anything the earth had yet seen. The descendants of Cain, in their pride and rebellion, were about to discover that some boundaries should never be crossed. The Nephilim, giants of the earth. The children born from the unions of watchers and daughters of men were unlike anything the world had ever seen. They grew with frightening speed, their bones stretching and strengthening until they towered over ordinary humans like trees over grass. By the time they reached maturity, the smallest among them stood twice the height of a normal man. These were the Nephilim, the fallen ones, and their very existence was an affront to the natural order. Their mothers often died in childbirth, unable to bear such massive offspring. Those women who survived were forever changed, aged beyond their years by the ordeal of bringing these hybrid beings into the world. The giants possessed strength that defied belief. They could lift stones that would require 20 men to move. Their hands could crush bones as easily as breaking twigs. When they walked, the ground trembled beneath their feet. When they spoke, their voices carried for miles, deep and resonant like distant thunder. But it was not just their size that set them apart. The Nephilim inherited otherworldly knowledge from their angelic fathers. They understood secrets of the earth and sky that no human should possess. They could predict when storms would come, where to find precious metals hidden deep underground, how to craft weapons that never dulled or broke. This knowledge made them invaluable to human rulers, but also incredibly dangerous. They became the champions of kings, the leaders of armies, the architects of great works. Cities rose faster under their guidance. Battles were won through their strategic insight. But everything they touched was tainted by their unnatural origin. The Nephilim were never content with serving others. Their angelic heritage filled them with pride that exceeded even that of Cain's descendants. They began to demand worship from ordinary humans. They set themselves up as gods, requiring sacrifices and absolute obedience from those they considered lesser beings. Their appetites were as enormous as their bodies. They consumed vast quantities of food, leaving entire regions stripped bare. When normal food wasn't enough, they began to crave more exotic fare. Some developed a taste for human flesh, becoming the monsters of legend that would haunt human memory for generations. War followed in their wake wherever they went. Their presence upset the delicate balance between human communities. Kings who possessed giants as allies grew arrogant and aggressive. Those without such champions lived in constant fear of attack. The earth became divided between those who served the Nephilim and those who hid from them. The giants reproduced among themselves, creating bloodlines of hybrid beings that grew ever more removed from humanity. Each generation became more alien, more hostile to the world that had given them birth. They built cities designed for their massive frames, with doors and halls that normal humans could barely navigate. Their influence on human culture was profound and lasting. They taught humans advanced techniques of warfare, construction, and crafts that would have taken centuries to develop naturally. But they also introduced practices that corrupted the soul. They showed humans how to make powerful weapons, but also how to use those weapons for conquest rather than protection. The Nephilim's greatest crime was not their violence or their pride, but their role in leading humanity further from God. They presented themselves as divine beings worthy of worship, stealing glory that belonged to the Creator alone. Their very existence was proof that the boundaries between heaven and earth had been violated. Some of the giants were more violent than others, but none were truly good. Even those who showed kindness to humans did so from a position of superiority, like a person might show kindness to a pet. They could never see humans as equals because their nature prevented such humility. The children born to human women who had been with Watchers but hadn't produced full giants were also changed. These offspring were larger and stronger than normal humans, but retained human appearance. They became the heroes and warriors of legend, mighty but mortal, carrying just enough angelic blood to be extraordinary. As the Nephilim multiplied, the world became increasingly dangerous for ordinary humans. The giants' conflicts with each other created devastation on a scale never before seen. When they fought, entire valleys were laid waste. When they moved their armies, rivers were diverted and mountains were scarred. The earth itself groaned under the weight of these unnatural beings. The harmony that had existed between humanity and creation was shattered. What had been a garden world was becoming a battlefield where the strong preyed upon the weak without mercy or restraint. Enoch the righteous, a contrast emerges. While darkness spread through the bloodline of Cain, light still flickered in another branch of the human family. In the seventh generation, from Adam through Seth's line, a child was born who would walk closer to God than any man since the garden. His name was Enoch, and his life would stand as a beacon against the growing shadows. Enoch grew up hearing stories of the old days when Adam walked with God in the cool of the evening. Unlike the descendants of Cain, who sought to build their own glory, Enoch yearned for that lost intimacy with his Creator. He spent long hours in prayer and meditation, seeking to understand God's heart in an increasingly corrupt world. As a young man, Enoch received his first vision. It came like a gentle breeze at first, a sense of presence that grew stronger until he found himself standing in what seemed like a vast heavenly court. Angels moved with purpose and dignity, their faces shining with holy light. At the center of it all was a throne of indescribable majesty. The vision lasted only moments in earthly time, but it changed Enoch forever. He understood that what was happening on earth was being watched from heaven with growing sorrow. The rebellion of the Watchers, the corruption of humanity, the violence of the Nephilim, all of it grieved the heart of God. From that day forward, Enoch's life took on new purpose. He began to preach to anyone who would listen, warning of coming judgment, but also offering hope through repentance. His message was simple but powerful. God had not abandoned humanity, and it was not too late to turn back from the path of destruction. The people of Seth's lineage received Enoch's words with mixed reactions. Some were stirred to renewed faithfulness, gathering with their families to pray and seek God's face. Others thought him too extreme, preferring to believe that surely God would overlook their small compromises with the world around them. Enoch's most challenging audience was found among the descendants of Cain. When he ventured into their cities to preach, he was met with mockery and threats. The Nephilim particularly despised him, seeing his message as a direct challenge to their claims of divinity. Several times he barely escaped with his life. But Enoch was not deterred by opposition. His communion with God grew deeper with each passing year. He began to receive regular visions, showing him the history of the world from its creation to its ultimate redemption. He saw the flood that was coming, the destruction of the wicked, but also the hope that would emerge from the remnant. These visions were not given for his comfort alone. Enoch felt compelled to record what he saw, creating the first written prophecies. He described the rebellion of the Watchers in detail, naming their leaders and revealing their secret teachings. He warned of the judgment that would fall upon the Nephilim and all who followed them. Word of Enoch's prophecies spread far beyond his own community. Even among the Cainites, some were troubled by his words. A few quietly sought him out, asking how they might escape the coming judgment. Enoch's answer was always the same. True repentance required not just sorrow for sin, but a complete turning away from the corrupt path. The Watchers themselves took notice of this troublesome prophet. They sent messages through their human allies offering him wealth and power if he would stop preaching against them. When bribes failed, they tried intimidation. But Enoch walked under divine protection, and their threats could not touch him. As Enoch aged, something remarkable began to happen. While other men grew frail and bent with years, he seemed to grow more vital, more radiant. His face carried a light that reminded people of Moses coming down from Mount Sinai. Children were drawn to him, sensing the peace that surrounded him like a gentle aura. His family life was blessed despite the surrounding darkness. His wife bore him children who inherited his faith and devotion. His son Methuselah would become known for his wisdom and longevity, carrying on his father's spiritual legacy. The household of Enoch became a place of refuge for those seeking truth in a world of lies. The most remarkable aspect of Enoch's ministry was not his preaching or his visions, but his walk with God. Day by day, year by year, he drew closer to his Creator. The boundary between earth and heaven seemed thin around him. Angels were frequently seen coming and going from his dwelling, though they remained invisible to those whose hearts were hardened. Enoch's life became a living contradiction to the claims of the Nephilim and their followers. While they declared themselves divine, he showed what true communion with the divine actually looked like. While they used their supernatural heritage to dominate and destroy, he used his spiritual gifts to heal and restore. The contrast could not have been starker. In one line of humanity, pride led to rebellion, rebellion to corruption, and corruption to destruction. In the other, humility led to obedience, obedience to blessing, and blessing to transformation. The choice facing humanity was becoming clear, even as time was running out. Prophecies of doom, Enoch's warnings. The visions came to Enoch with increasing frequency and intensity as the corruption on earth deepened. In dreams and waking trances, he was shown the unfolding drama of divine justice. What he saw filled him with both terror and urgency. The time for gentle warnings was passing. The hour of judgment drew near. Standing before assemblies of both righteous and wicked, Enoch's voice carried the weight of divine authority. His words cut through the noise of daily life like a sword through silk. He spoke of the Watchers by name, describing their rebellion and the punishment that awaited them. His accuracy in revealing their secret deeds convinced many that he truly spoke for God. The Watchers themselves began to fear this mortal prophet. They had grown comfortable in their rebellion, believing themselves beyond the reach of divine justice. But Enoch's prophecy suggested otherwise. He described chains of darkness, imprisonment beneath the earth, and judgment that would last until the end of days. To Azazel, the leader who had taught humans to make weapons of war, Enoch delivered this message: "You will be bound with chains of iron and cast into the darkness. All the violence you have taught will return upon your own head. The blood of the innocent cries out for justice." To Shemhaza, who had first descended to take human wives, the prophecy was equally severe. "Your mighty offspring will be destroyed, and you will watch their destruction. Furkat, the corruption you began will be washed clean from the earth, but you will remain to face the consequences of your choices." The other Watchers received similar pronouncements. Each was named, each had their crimes detailed, each learned of the specific punishment awaiting them. Enoch's words spread through their ranks, creating fear and desperation. Some sought to kill the prophet, but found themselves unable to approach him when he was under divine protection. But Enoch's harshest warnings were reserved for the Nephilim. These hybrid beings had used their supernatural heritage to set themselves up as gods, demanding worship from humans and consuming the earth's resources without restraint. They had become the worst of both their angelic and human natures, proud as angels but greedy as fallen men. "You giants of the earth," Enoch proclaimed, "you think your size makes you mighty, but you are already dead in God's eyes. Your flesh will rot, but your spirits will find no rest. You will wander as demons, seeking bodies to inhabit, but finding no peace. The judgment begins with you." The Nephilim raged at these words, but they could not silence the prophet. Every attempt to harm him failed. When they sent armies, the soldiers would lose their way or turn back in fear. When they tried to corrupt his followers, their temptations fell on deaf ears. The protection around Enoch was absolute. Human rulers who had allied themselves with the Watchers and Nephilim also received warnings. Kings who had sold their people's souls for supernatural aid learned that their bargains were about to come due. The power they had gained would be stripped away, and they would face judgment, both divine and human. "The crown on your head is made of straw," Enoch told one such king. "Your palace walls will not protect you when the waters rise. Your giant allies will abandon you when their own destruction comes. Turn now, while there is still time, or perish with those you have chosen to serve." Some rulers were shaken by these words and attempted reform. They expelled the Watchers from their courts and tried to make amends for their crimes. But most had gone too far down the path of corruption to turn back easily. Their hearts were hardened, their consciences seared, their capacity for repentance nearly destroyed. Enoch also warned the common people who had been led astray. Many had participated in the corruption not from malice, but from weakness or ignorance. For these, his message carried both warning and hope. Repentance was still possible, but time was running short. "The rain is already gathering in the clouds," he would tell the crowds. "The windows of heaven are about to open. Build an ark of righteousness around your family. Gather the clean things of life and leave behind the corrupt. The flood comes not just to destroy, but to cleanse and renew." His prophecies extended beyond the immediate crisis to reveal God's ultimate plan for humanity. He spoke of a time when the earth would be restored, when the righteous would inherit the land, when peace and justice would reign. But first must come the great cleansing, the washing away of all that had been corrupted. The descendants of Seth heard these prophecies with mixed emotions. Relief that judgment would finally come upon the wicked was tempered by sorrow for what would be lost. Many had friends and family members among the Cainites who would be swept away. Enoch's warnings forced difficult choices about relationships and loyalties. As the visions intensified, Enoch began to see not just the flood, but the specific timing of events. He saw Noah receiving instructions for the ark, the gathering of animals, the final days of grace before the rain began. This knowledge filled him with even greater urgency in his preaching. The Watchers made one last desperate attempt to change their fate. They approached Enoch through intermediaries, offering to reform their ways if he would intercede for them with God. But the prophet's response was uncompromising. The time for repentance had passed for the angelic beings. Their judgment was sealed. The fall of the Watchers. Divine retribution. The patience of heaven had finally reached its limit. What had begun as rebellion among a few angels had grown into a cosmic catastrophe that threatened the very purpose of creation. The time for divine intervention had come, and it would be swift, decisive, and irreversible. The judgment began with a sound that penetrated every corner of existence. It was not heard with physical ears, but felt in the depths of every spirit. The Watchers, wherever they were on earth, suddenly found themselves unable to access the supernatural powers they had taken for granted. Their connection to the heavenly realm was severed in an instant. Michael the archangel appeared first to Shemhaza, the leader of the rebellion. The Watcher was in his palace, surrounded by human servants and his hybrid offspring, when suddenly the air grew thick with divine presence. The walls seemed to dissolve, revealing the massive figure of God's champion, sword drawn and face blazing with righteous anger. "Your time is finished," Michael declared, his voice shaking the foundations of the earth. "By your own choices, you have forfeited your place among the sons of heaven. You will be bound until the day of final judgment." Shemhaza tried to resist, calling upon the dark powers he had cultivated during his time on earth, but his rebellion had cut him off from the source of all true power. His supernatural strength failed him like water poured out on dry ground. Chains of spiritual force wrapped around him, invisible to human eyes but absolute in their binding. Across the earth, similar scenes were playing out. Each of the 200 Watchers who had descended found themselves confronted by angelic enforcers. Azazel, who had taught humans the arts of war, discovered that all his knowledge of combat was useless against heavenly warriors. Penemu, who had revealed the secrets of writing, found that words held no power against divine decree. The human women who had been wives to the Watchers watched in terror as their supernatural husbands were dragged away. Some of these women wept for their lost lovers, but others felt relief as the oppressive spiritual atmosphere that had surrounded the Watchers finally lifted. The unnatural passions that had bound them began to fade like fog before the morning sun. The Nephilim, offspring of these unions, were not destroyed immediately, but they were marked for destruction. The divine power that had enhanced their already formidable abilities was withdrawn. They found themselves still giants in stature, but diminished in every other way. Their strategic insights became clouded, their strength remained, but lost its supernatural edge. More importantly, the Nephilim discovered that their fathers could no longer protect them. The Watchers, who had once seemed all-powerful, were now prisoners, bound in chains of darkness and cast into deep places beneath the earth. The hybrid giants suddenly faced the possibility of their own mortality. Some of the Watchers were cast into a place called Dudael, a wilderness of sharp stones and perpetual darkness. Here they were bound with chains that burned like fire but could not be broken. They could see nothing, hear nothing but their own torment, yet remained fully conscious of their fall from grace. Others were imprisoned beneath mountains or in deep caves, places where the weight of earth itself became part of their bondage. The knowledge they had used to corrupt humanity became a source of endless regret as they contemplated the consequences of their choices with perfect clarity but no power to change them. The most terrible punishment was reserved for those who had been most active in corrupting human society. They were bound in a place where they could see everything happening on Earth, but could do nothing to influence events. They watched helplessly as their human followers struggled without supernatural aid, as their hybrid children faced mounting opposition, as the world they had helped corrupt began to crumble. Raphael was given the task of binding Azazel, the one who had taught the arts of war and metalworking. The archangel found the Watcher surrounded by weapons he had helped humans create, but none of them could provide protection against divine judgment. Azazel was wrapped in darkness and cast into the desert, where sharp stones cut his spirit but could not grant him the release of true death. Uriel confronted the Watchers who had revealed heavenly secrets, stripping them of the knowledge they had misused and casting them into places of ignorance and confusion. Gabriel dealt with those who had corrupted human sexuality and marriage, binding them where they could no longer tempt or seduce. The human allies of the Watchers found themselves suddenly abandoned. Kings who had relied on supernatural counsel were left to face their enemies with only human wisdom. Warriors who had been enhanced by angelic power discovered their strength was merely mortal. Priests who had served in corrupted temples found their rituals empty of supernatural response. Some humans who had been deeply involved with the Watchers were driven mad by the sudden absence of the spiritual forces they had grown dependent upon. They wandered through their cities like lost children, calling out for masters who could no longer hear or respond. Others collapsed under the weight of guilt as the unnatural influences that had dulled their consciences were removed. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the effect on the children born from these unholy unions. The Nephilim and their descendants had always known they were different, but now they began to understand they were also doomed. Without their father's protection, they became vulnerable to both human opposition and divine judgment. The binding of the Watchers marked the beginning of the end for the corrupt civilization they had helped create. Like a house built on sand, the society that had seemed so strong and permanent began to show cracks. The supernatural advantages that had made the Cainite cities powerful were gone, leaving only human pride and violence to sustain them. Heaven's message was clear. The corruption would not be allowed to continue indefinitely. The patience of God had limits, and those limits had been reached. What came next would cleanse the earth of the hybrid abominations and the human corruption they had fostered. Noah's time, the days of increasing wickedness. The world that Noah was born into bore little resemblance to the garden paradise his ancestors had known. Corruption had spread like poison through every level of society. What had once been isolated pockets of wickedness now dominated entire regions. The binding of the Watchers had not reformed humanity. It had only removed their supernatural restraints. Without the Watchers to guide and control them, the Nephilim became even more dangerous. Desperate to maintain their dominance, they turned to ever more violent means. Their wars with each other devastated vast territories. Cities that had taken generations to build were reduced to rubble in a matter of days when giants clashed in battle. The human population lived in constant fear. Those who served the Nephilim were barely better than slaves, forced to provide food and resources for beings whose appetites seemed endless. Those who tried to remain independent were hunted down and destroyed. The middle ground between submission and extinction had all but disappeared. Crime became so common that it was barely remarked upon. Murder was an accepted way to settle disputes. Theft was considered a skill rather than a sin. Marriage vows were broken as easily as they were made. Children were abandoned or sold when they became inconvenient. The bonds that held society together had dissolved. In this chaos, Noah's family stood out like a lighthouse in a storm. His grandfather Enoch had been taken up by God years before, sparing him the sight of humanity's final descent into darkness. But Enoch's teachings lived on through his son Methuselah and grandson Lamech, who passed them down to Noah with urgent intensity. Noah's father Lamech was not the violent Lamech of Cain's line, but a righteous man who yearned for redemption. When Noah was born, Lamech prophesied that his son would bring comfort from the curse that lay upon the ground. Little did he know how literally that prophecy would be fulfilled. Growing up in this corrupt world, Noah learned early to trust in God rather than men. He saw how quickly human nature could turn violent when not restrained by divine law. He witnessed the casual cruelty of the Nephilim and their human followers. Yet somehow he maintained his faith in the God his ancestors had served. Noah's righteousness was not passive. He preached against the corruption around him, calling people to repentance with the same boldness his great-grandfather Enoch had shown. But the hearts of men had grown harder in the intervening years. Where Enoch had found some who would listen, Noah found mostly mockery and threats. The technology developed during the golden age of Cainite civilization was now turned toward destruction. Advanced metallurgy produced weapons that could kill dozens with a single blow. Engineering knowledge was used to build siege engines and fortifications. The music that had once lifted hearts now served to coordinate massive armies in battle. Even the earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of corruption. Natural disasters became more frequent and severe. Earthquakes shook regions that had never known such violence. Storms grew more powerful and unpredictable. The harmony between humanity and creation that had existed since the beginning was broken. The Nephilim, sensing their own doom approaching, became increasingly desperate. Some tried to reproduce frantically, hoping to ensure their bloodline's survival. Others turned to dark rituals, attempting to contact their imprisoned fathers or summon other supernatural powers to their aid. A few even tried to build towers that could reach heaven itself, as if they could force their way back into God's presence. Human society fragmented into countless warring factions. The great cities that had once been centers of learning and culture became fortified camps where might made right. Trade routes were abandoned as travel became too dangerous. Knowledge was hoarded rather than shared, as each group tried to gain any advantage over their enemies. Women and children suffered the most in this chaotic world. They became prizes to be won through violence, rather than partners to be cherished. Families were torn apart by the constant warfare. Many children never knew peace or security, growing up knowing only conflict and fear. Yet even in this darkness, some light remained. Scattered families and small communities still tried to live according to God's ways. They met in secret to worship, to share their faith, to encourage one another. These righteous remnants looked to Noah as their leader and teacher, hoping against hope that deliverance might still come. Noah's own family became a refuge for many seeking to escape the corruption. His wife was a woman of strong faith who shared his commitment to righteousness. His 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were raised in the knowledge of God, despite the evil influences surrounding them. Their household stood as proof that it was still possible to live holy lives even in an unholy world. As the years passed, God's patience with humanity grew shorter. The violence had reached levels that made even the worst days of Cain's descendants seem peaceful by comparison. The earth was filled with corruption, and all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. The time for judgment was drawing near. Noah continued to preach, but his message began to change. Where once he had called primarily for repentance, now he began to warn of coming destruction. He spoke of a flood that would cleanse the earth, of judgment that would fall upon all the wicked. Most dismissed his words as the ramblings of a madman, but some listened with growing concern. The signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Animals began behaving strangely, gathering in unusual patterns as if responding to some hidden signal. The weather grew more erratic, with seasons blending together in unnatural ways. Even the stars seemed different, as if heaven itself was preparing for momentous change. In this world of increasing darkness, Noah received the call that would change everything. God spoke to him with the same clarity that he had once spoken to Adam in the garden. The message was simple but earth-shaking. Build an ark, for the end of all flesh had come before God, and he would destroy the earth with a flood. The last days. Noah builds the ark. The morning when God first spoke to Noah about the ark dawned like any other day of violence and chaos. The sounds of distant warfare drifted across the valley where Noah's family had made their home. Smoke from burning cities stained the horizon. Yet in this peaceful hollow, something extraordinary was about to begin. Noah heard the voice as clearly as if someone were standing beside him, though no human form was visible. The instructions were detailed and specific. Build an ark of gopher wood, cover it inside and out with pitch, make it 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Include 3 decks, rooms throughout, and a window for light. To any observer, the command would have seemed impossible. Noah lived far from any large body of water. The sheer size of the vessel God described was beyond anything that had ever been built. The amount of wood required would take years to gather. Yet Noah did not question or hesitate. He had walked with God long enough to trust, even when understanding failed. His family received the news with mixed emotions. His wife, faithful companion of many years, trusted her husband's relationship with God completely. If Noah said God had spoken, then God had spoken, regardless of how strange the command might seem. She immediately began planning how their household could support such an enormous undertaking. Shem, Ham, and Japheth reacted according to their different natures. Shem, the eldest, quickly grasped the spiritual significance of what was happening and threw himself into the work with religious devotion. Ham was more interested in the technical challenges and began calculating measurements and logistics. Japheth saw it as an adventure and was eager to begin the actual construction. Word of Noah's strange building project spread quickly through the surrounding communities. Most people assumed he had finally lost his mind. A boat hundreds of feet long, built on dry ground miles from the nearest river. The mockery was immediate and relentless. Children would dare each other to run past the construction site and shout insults at the crazy old man and his family. But some of the ridicule carried an edge of fear. Noah's reputation as a prophet was well established, even among those who rejected his message. If he was building an ark, could his warnings about coming judgment actually be true? A few thoughtful observers began to watch the project with growing unease. The work began with gathering materials. Noah and his sons traveled far and wide, selecting the finest gopher wood they could find. Each tree had to be carefully chosen for strength and durability. The process was slow and methodical, as befitted a vessel that would need to survive the greatest storm in history. Local craftsmen were hired to help with specialized tasks. Most came for the wages Noah offered, but some stayed because they were intrigued by the quality of the work. Every joint was perfectly fitted, every surface smooth and true. Whatever this strange vessel was intended for, it was being built to the highest possible standards. The pitch covering process presented its own challenges. The tar-like substance had to be heated and applied evenly to every surface, inside and out. The smell was overwhelming and the work was dangerous. Burns were common as the hot pitch splashed and dripped. Yet the family persevered, knowing that their lives would depend on the ark's watertight integrity. As the months turned to years, the ark began to take shape. The massive hull dominated the landscape, visible from miles away. Travelers would detour from their planned routes just to see the enormous structure. Some came to mock, others came out of curiosity, but all went away with something to talk about. The interior construction was as impressive as the exterior. Rooms and compartments were built according to a precise plan that seemed to account for every possible need. Storage areas for food and water, living spaces for Noah's family, and countless pens and cages for animals filled the 3 decks. The organization was so logical that it clearly came from a mind far greater than human intelligence. Opposition to the project grew as it neared completion. Some of the local Nephilim saw the ark as a potential threat, though they couldn't understand exactly why. They sent groups of warriors to intimidate Noah into abandoning the work, but every attempt failed. Divine protection surrounded the construction site like an invisible wall. The most vocal criticism came from the religious leaders of the day. They proclaimed that Noah's prophecies of judgment were blasphemous, that God would never destroy his creation so completely. They organized protests and prayer meetings intended to counteract what they saw as dangerous false prophecy. Their influence turned many people against Noah's family. Yet even as opposition mounted, some began to take Noah's warnings seriously. They approached him quietly, asking what they could do to escape the coming judgment. Noah's answer was always the same: true repentance, complete turning away from the corrupt society around them, and faith in God's mercy. Some were willing to make such changes, but most found the cost too high. The final year of construction brought increasing urgency. Noah began receiving more specific instructions about gathering animals and supplies. The complexity of the task was staggering. How do you collect representatives of every species on Earth? How do you feed them during a long voyage? How do you prevent them from eating each other? But God's provision matched the magnitude of the challenge. Animals began arriving on their own, drawn by instincts they couldn't understand. They came from distant lands, species that Noah had never seen before. Predators walked peacefully alongside their natural prey, all hostility suspended by divine influence. The sight of animals streaming toward the ark from every direction finally convinced some skeptics that something supernatural was happening. Lions walked beside lambs, bears ambled alongside deer, and serpents slithered peacefully among birds. The natural order itself was being temporarily suspended in preparation for the coming catastrophe. Noah's family worked frantically to accommodate their unexpected guests. Food had to be gathered and stored not just for the human passengers, but for creatures with vastly different dietary needs. Fresh water had to be collected in quantities sufficient for a voyage of unknown duration. Every available space in the ark was carefully organized and packed. The people of the surrounding communities watched these preparations with growing alarm. Those who had laughed at Noah's project now found their laughter dying in their throats. The evidence of divine intervention was becoming impossible to deny. Yet still, most refused to believe that judgment would actually come. They convinced themselves that the strange behavior of the animals was temporary, that whatever crisis was approaching would somehow pass them by. In the final days before the flood, Noah made one last desperate attempt to save his neighbors. He went from house to house, pleading with families to join him in the ark. His message was simple: the time of grace was almost over, but salvation was still possible for those willing to turn to God with sincere hearts. A few were moved by his urgency and began to consider seriously whether they should abandon their homes and possessions to follow this strange prophet. But the social pressure against such a decision was enormous. To join Noah meant leaving behind everything familiar, admitting that their entire way of life had been wrong, and trusting their lives to what still seemed like the delusion of a madman. The final week arrived with an ominous stillness in the air. The constant warfare that had raged across the earth for generations suddenly ceased, as if all combatants were holding their breath. Even the Nephilim seemed subdued, sensing that their time of dominance was coming to an end. The very atmosphere felt heavy with impending change. On the appointed day, Noah and his family entered the ark. The animals followed in an orderly procession that continued for hours. Clean animals came by sevens, unclean by pairs, exactly as God had commanded. Birds filled the sky in vast flocks before settling in their designated areas within the vessel. The organization was perfect, beyond anything human planning could have achieved. The most remarkable moment came when the loading was complete. Noah stood at the entrance to the ark, looking out at the world he was about to leave behind. For the last time, he called out to anyone who might still be willing to enter and be saved. His voice carried across the valley, reaching the ears of hundreds who had come to witness what they expected to be the final chapter in the strange story of Noah's folly. Then, without any human hand touching it, the door of the ark swung shut. The sound of its closing echoed like thunder across the landscape. Those watching felt a chill run down their spines as they realized that the last opportunity for escape had just passed. Whatever was about to happen, they would face it outside the safety of the ark. Inside the vessel, Noah's family felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had obeyed God's commands completely, but they were now sealed inside a wooden box with thousands of animals, trusting that the same God who had commanded them to build it would also preserve their lives. The test of their faith was about to begin in earnest. The flood begins. The waters rise. 7 days passed in strange silence after the ark was sealed. The crowds that had gathered to witness Noah's supposed folly gradually dispersed, some disappointed that nothing dramatic had happened, others relieved that their mockery had not been answered with divine wrath. Life seemed to return to its familiar patterns of violence and corruption. But those with spiritual sensitivity could feel something building in the atmosphere. Animals that had not entered the ark grew restless and agitated. Dogs howled at night for no apparent reason. Birds refused to sing their morning songs. Even insects seemed to move with unusual urgency, as if responding to signals invisible to human perception. The sky, which had been clear when the ark was sealed, began to change on the seventh day. Clouds gathered with unnatural speed, boiling up from the horizon like mountains of gray wool. The air grew thick and humid, pressing down on the earth with almost physical weight. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no lightning could be seen. Noah's family felt the first drops of rain through the window of the ark. After so many years of preaching about coming judgment, the reality of it actually beginning filled them with awe and terror. They gathered together in prayer, thanking God for his mercy in preserving them, while acknowledging the justice of his judgment upon a corrupt world. Outside, people looked up at the darkening sky with the first stirrings of real concern. Rain was not uncommon, but something about these clouds was different. They seemed to cover the entire visible sky, blotting out the sun and creating a premature twilight that felt ominous and threatening. The temperature began to drop as the light faded. The rain began as a gentle sprinkle, no different from countless other showers that had watered the earth since creation. Children played in the puddles, and adults went about their business with only minor inconvenience. Some even joked that this was Noah's great flood, nothing more than an ordinary rainstorm that would pass in a few hours. But the gentle sprinkle became a steady shower, and the steady shower became a downpour. Water fell from the sky with increasing intensity, drumming on rooftops and flooding through streets. What had been puddles became streams. Streams became rivers, and rivers began to overflow their banks with frightening speed. More alarming than the rain from above was what began happening below. Springs that had never existed before burst forth from the ground. The fountains of the great deep were breaking up, exactly as Noah had prophesied. Water erupted from fissures in the earth, creating geysers and floods in places that had been completely dry just hours before. The Nephilim were among the first the magnitude of what was happening. Their supernatural heritage, though diminished, still gave them insights beyond normal human understanding. They gathered their followers and began moving toward higher ground, but even as they climbed, the water seemed to follow them with relentless determination. In the great cities that had been centers of Cainite civilization, panic began to set in. People who had lived their entire lives surrounded by stone walls and bronze gates discovered that their fortifications meant nothing against the rising flood. Water poured through the streets like living creatures, seeking out every low place and filling it completely. The technology that had been humanity's pride proved useless against the deluge. Advanced drainage systems were overwhelmed in minutes. Strong buildings that had withstood earthquakes and wars crumbled as their foundations were undermined by the rushing water. The weapons that had made men feel powerful were helpless against an enemy that could not be fought or intimidated. Those who had mocked Noah's preaching began to remember his words with growing terror. His prophecies about divine judgment, which had seemed like the ravings of a madman, were being fulfilled with terrifying accuracy. Some tried to reach the ark, but found their way blocked by rapidly rising water and the supernatural protection that surrounded Noah's vessel. Families were torn apart as the floodwaters rose. Parents lost children in the chaos, and children were swept away from their homes by currents too strong to resist. The social bonds that held communities together dissolved as quickly as the physical structures that housed them. It became every person for themselves in a desperate struggle for survival. The wealthy discovered that their riches could not buy them safety from divine judgment. Gold and silver sank to the bottom as quickly as stones. Fine clothing became waterlogged and heavy, dragging down those who wore it. The palaces and treasures that had been accumulated through centuries of corruption were swept away like dust before the wind. Animals that had not been chosen for the ark fled in terror before the advancing waters. Wild creatures and domestic animals ran together, their natural instincts overridden by the desperate need to escape. But there was no escape. The water was everywhere, rising from below and falling from above, with a consistency that made clear this was no natural disaster. Some groups tried to build their own arks, hastily constructing rafts and boats in imitation of Noah's great vessel. But these makeshift craft were no match for the supernatural storm. They were torn apart by winds that seemed to blow from every direction at once, or overwhelmed by waves that rose higher than any ocean had ever known. The daughters of Cain, who had been the most beautiful and sought-after women in the corrupt world, found that their beauty could not save them from the rising waters. Those who had used their attractiveness to gain power and wealth now discovered that divine judgment made no distinction between the lovely and the plain, the desired and the despised. Within hours, what had been dry land was covered by water deeper than the height of a man. Within days, the highest hills were submerged. The flood was not simply rising, it was consuming the earth with an appetite that seemed infinite. Every trace of the corrupt civilization was being systematically erased. Inside the ark, Noah's family listened to the sounds of destruction outside their wooden walls. They could hear the cries of those who had rejected their warnings, the crash of falling buildings, the roar of water claiming territory that had been dry since creation. The sounds were heartbreaking, but they were also proof of God's justice being executed exactly as he had promised. The rain continued day after day without pause. The windows of heaven had been opened, and it seemed as if all the water that had ever been held back was now being released at once. The earth that had been cursed since Adam's fall was being washed clean, prepared for a fresh start, with the righteous remnant that floated safely in their wooden sanctuary. The daughters lost, extinction of a line. The waters came slowly at first, like tears from heaven, gentle drops that seemed almost kind. The daughters of Cain felt the moisture on their skin and laughed. They had known drought before. They had weathered storms. This felt different, but not dangerous. Not yet. Naamah stood at her window, watching the sky grow heavy with clouds. Her beauty had not faded with age. The forbidden knowledge she carried still sparkled in her dark eyes. She had taught kings to read the stars. She had shown craftsmen how to work metals that sang when struck. She had danced with beings that fell from heaven itself. Now she watched water begin to pool in the streets below. The other daughters gathered in their halls of stone and bronze. Ada's children played music that echoed off marble walls. Zillah's sons forged weapons that gleamed like captured starlight. The granddaughters and great-granddaughters of Cain went about their lives as they always had. They created. They celebrated. They ignored the gentle warnings that came with each new drop of rain. But Noah's hammer kept falling. Each blow against the ark's hull rang out like a bell tolling time itself. The righteous man worked with steady hands while the daughters of Cain danced. He sealed joints with pitch, while they sealed their fate with pride. The contrast could not have been sharper. One man building toward salvation, an entire lineage building toward nothing at all. The rain grew heavier, streets became streams, streams became rivers, rivers became rushing torrents that carried away the works of centuries. The daughters watched their world dissolve before their eyes. The cities their ancestor built began to crumble. The bronze and iron their sons had mastered could not hold back the water. The music their children had perfected was drowned by the roar of the flood. Nama was among the last to understand. She had lived so long, seen so much, that change seemed impossible. The forbidden arts she practiced had given her glimpses of eternity. She thought herself beyond the reach of divine judgment. When the water reached her ankles, she still believed she could survive. When it reached her waist, doubt crept in like cold fingers around her heart. The other daughters faced their end in different ways. Some ran to high places, climbing towers and mountains. Others gathered their children close and whispered the old stories one last time. A few stood defiant until the very end, cursing the god who had marked their ancestor. But the water cared nothing for their courage or their curses. It rose with the patience of eternity itself. The children of the Watchers, the giants who had terrorized the earth, found their great strength useless against the flood. They could lift boulders, but not lift themselves above the rising sea. They could tear down walls, but not build wings to fly. One by one, these mighty beings who had seemed like gods themselves sank beneath the waves. The last of Cain's daughters left this world as the water closed over their heads. With them went centuries of knowledge. The songs they had sung would never be heard again. The crafts they had mastered died with their hands. The beauty that had tempted angels became food for fish. An entire branch of humanity, the very first branch to grow from Adam's tree, was cut away forever. Yet even as they drowned, some say the daughters spoke final words. Nama, they claim, uttered a prophecy about bloodlines that would remember. Ada sang a melody that would echo in later music. Zillah spoke a blessing that would find its way to other mothers in other times. These stories may be true, they may be wishes, but they speak to something deeper than history. The flood took more than lives. It took possibilities. It took the road not taken. The daughters of Cain represented humanity's first great experiment with freedom from divine law. They showed what mortals could achieve when they chose their own path. They also showed where that path led when it turned away from wisdom. As the last daughter disappeared beneath the waves, something ended that had begun with history itself. The lineage that fell was more than just Cain's family. It was humanity's first attempt at independence. The water that covered them also covered that dream of pure human achievement. What rose from those waters would be different. Chastened, changed. The ark floated above the graves of the daughters. Inside, Noah's family carried the future of the world, but they also carried questions that would never be fully answered. What if the daughters had chosen differently? What if Cain's mark had led to redemption instead of rebellion? What if the beauty that tempted angels had been used to glorify their creator instead? These questions sank with the daughters. The world that emerged from the flood would be smaller, simpler, but perhaps wiser. The grand experiments were over. The age of the daughters of Cain had ended. Only the echoes remained, waiting to be discovered by later generations who would wonder what their ancestors had lost beneath the waves. Survivors and myth. Did they all perish? The waters receded slowly, like memory fading from an old man's mind. When the earth showed itself again, it was clean and empty. The cities of Cain were gone. The daughters who had ruled them were gone. The giants who had walked among them were gone. Or were they? Noah's family stepped onto dry ground carrying more than just their lives. They carried stories. They carried names. They carried the blood of Adam, and in that blood, perhaps, traces of all who had come before. The question that would haunt scholars for centuries was simple. Had every trace of Cain's lineage truly died in the flood? The ancient stories suggest otherwise. When the sons of Noah began to spread across the earth, they found things that should not have been there. Cities that seemed familiar, customs that echoed the old ways, people who looked like those who should have been forgotten. These discoveries planted seeds of doubt in the minds of those who came after. Ham, Noah's youngest son traveled to lands that reminded him of stories his father had told. He found ruins that seemed to whisper of the world before the flood. Some say he found more than ruins. Some say he found survivors. Not descendants of Noah, but descendants of those who should have perished beneath the waves. These claims cannot be proven, but they cannot be dismissed either. The daughters of Cain had been beautiful, powerful, and clever. Is it so strange to think that some might have found ways to survive? The forbidden knowledge they possessed included secrets of the earth itself. They knew where high places were. They knew how to read the signs of sky and sea. Could some have prepared for what was coming? Consider Nama, whose name means pleasant or beautiful. Later traditions claim she was more than just one of Cain's daughters. They say she was Noah's wife. If this is true, then the very woman who helped save humanity from the flood was herself one of the daughters who should have perished in it. The irony is too perfect to ignore, even if it cannot be confirmed. The genetic puzzle grows more complex when we examine Noah's sons and their descendants. Shem, Ham, and Japheth each fathered peoples who showed traits that seemed to echo the old world. Ham's descendants included the Canaanites, who practiced arts that resembled those of Cain's children. They built cities that reflected the same ambitions. They developed technologies that echoed the same rebellious spirit. Could this be coincidence? Or could the blood of the daughters somehow have survived the flood through marriage, through hidden lineages, through the complex web of human relationships that existed before the great catastrophe? The Bible itself suggests that the line between Seth's descendants and Cain's descendants was not always clear. Intermarriage between the lines may have preserved genetic traces that no flood could wash away. The myths of later peoples support this possibility. The Greeks told stories of titans who had ruled before the gods. The Mesopotamians spoke of the Apkallu, wise beings who had taught humanity before a great flood destroyed their world. The similarities between these myths and the biblical account of the daughters of Cain are too striking to ignore. Archaeological evidence hints at the same conclusion. Sites around the world show signs of advanced civilizations that seem to predate what we would expect from post-flood humanity. Technologies appear and disappear. Knowledge surfaces in places where it should not exist. These mysteries could be explained if some remnant of pre-flood wisdom had survived the catastrophe. The daughters of Cain represented more than just individuals. They represented a way of thinking, a way of living, a way of relating to the divine. That mindset may have been too deeply rooted in human nature to be completely washed away by any flood. It may have survived in hidden forms, in secret traditions, in the dreams and ambitions of Noah's descendants. Some scholars suggest that the Tower of Babel represents this survival. The builders of that great tower showed the same prideful ambition that had marked Cain's lineage. They wanted to reach heaven through their own efforts. They wanted to make a name for themselves. These desires echo the same themes that had driven the daughters of Cain to seek forbidden knowledge and forbidden unions. The question of survival becomes more than historical curiosity when we consider its implications. If the daughters of Cain left no trace, then the flood was a complete reset. Humanity started fresh with Noah's family. But if some genetic or cultural memory survived, then the flood was only a pause in an ongoing story. The same tensions, the same choices, the same temptations would arise again and again. The truth may be unknowable. The floodwaters covered more than lives and cities. They covered evidence. They covered certainty. What remains is mystery, and in that mystery, the daughters of Cain achieve a kind of immortality. They become not just historical figures, but symbols of all that humanity has lost and all that it continues to seek. Whether they survived in flesh or only in memory, the daughters of Cain left their mark on the world that followed. Their story became humanity's story. Their choices became humanity's choices. Their legacy became humanity's inheritance, passed down through bloodlines that may or may not have carried their genes, but certainly carried their dreams. Post-flood legends, the echoes of Cain. The world after the flood was supposed to be clean, fresh, new. But echoes have a way of traveling through time, and the echoes of Cain's lineage seem to follow Noah's descendants wherever they went. The daughters who had supposedly died beneath the waves began to appear in the stories, customs, and peoples of the New World. The Canaanites were among the first to catch attention. These descendants of Ham built cities that seemed familiar to those who remembered the old stories. They practiced crafts that echoed the work of Tubal-Cain. They worshipped in ways that recalled the forbidden unions between heaven and earth. Their women were known for beauty that could enchant kings and warriors alike. The resemblance to Cain's daughters was impossible to ignore. Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Canaanites, bore striking similarities to the daughters of the first murderer. She was beautiful beyond measure. She was associated with both love and war. She demanded sacrifices that horrified the children of Israel. In her temple prostitution, some saw echoes of the unions between the sons of God and the daughters of men. In her rituals, they glimpsed the forbidden knowledge that Naamah had once possessed. The city builders of Mesopotamia told similar stories. Babylon, that great city of human ambition, seemed to carry the spirit of Enoch, the first city that Cain had built. The tower they constructed reached toward heaven with the same pride that had marked the descendants of the first murderer. Their scholars preserved knowledge that seemed to come from before the flood. Their magicians practiced arts that resembled those of the daughters who had consorted with fallen angels. Inanna, the Sumerian goddess, was another figure who seemed to echo the lost daughters. She was the queen of heaven and earth. She possessed wisdom that predated human civilization. She descended to the underworld and returned with secrets that no mortal should know. Her beauty was legendary. Her power was feared. In her story, many saw reflections of Naamah and her sisters. The Egyptians preserved their own versions of these echoes. Isis, the great goddess mother, possessed knowledge of magic that seemed to come from the time before time. She could restore the dead to life. She could command the forces of nature. She was the divine feminine principle that had been lost when the daughters of Cain perished in the flood. Through her worship, that principle seemed to return to the world. The Greeks inherited these same themes through their own myths. The Titans, those ancient powers who had ruled before the gods, resembled the Nephilim in their strength and their rebellion. Prometheus, who stole fire from heaven, echoed the story of the Watchers who had brought forbidden knowledge to earth. The Sirens, whose beauty and song could destroy sailors, seemed like distant memories of the daughters whose allure had proven fatal to angels. These echoes were not just mythological. They appeared in the practices and beliefs of real peoples. The Philistines, enemies of Israel, worshipped Dagon and other deities that seemed to carry forward the traditions of the pre-flood world. Their warriors were giants like Goliath, who reminded everyone of the Nephilim who had once terrorized the earth. Their culture celebrated the same virtues that had marked Cain's descendants: strength, craftsmanship, and proud independence. The Phoenicians, master sailors and traders, preserved knowledge of the sea that seemed to come from before the flood. Their ships carried not just goods, but stories and customs that echoed the old world. They founded colonies across the Mediterranean, spreading the same urban civilization that had begun with Cain's city of Enoch. Their goddess Astarte was another reflection of the divine feminine that had been lost with the daughters. Even the Israelites, the chosen people who were supposed to be separate from these echoes, found themselves influenced by them. The Song of Songs celebrates a love that echoes the passion between the sons of God and the daughters of men. The wisdom literature of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes grapples with questions that might have been asked by the philosophers of Cain's cities. The very human desire for knowledge and achievement that had marked the first lineage continued to surface among the people of God. The echoes appeared in unexpected places. The builders of stone circles and megalithic monuments seemed to possess engineering knowledge that had been lost and found again. The metalworkers who emerged in various cultures practiced techniques that resembled those of Tubal-Cain. The musicians who created the first complex instruments seemed to channel the spirit of Jubal, even if they had never heard his name. These echoes raise profound questions about the nature of human civilization. Did the flood truly end the influence of Cain's lineage, or did it simply force that influence underground? Were the later peoples who exhibited these traits developing independently, Or were they drawing on some deeper memory that had survived the catastrophe? The answer may lie in understanding what the daughters of Cain truly represented. They were not just individuals, but symbols of humanity's relationship with knowledge, power, and divine authority. They embodied the eternal tension between submission and rebellion, between accepting limits and pushing beyond them. That tension did not die with them in the flood. It was too fundamental to human nature to be washed away by any amount of water. The echoes of Cain's lineage in post-flood cultures suggest that the story of the daughters was not really about genetics or bloodlines. It was about choices. It was about the paths that open before every generation. It was about the eternal human temptation to reach for more than we are given, to know more than we should know, to become more than we were created to be. In this sense, every culture that emerged after the flood carried the potential to echo the daughters of Cain. Every civilization that reached for greatness walked the same path that had led to the first cities. Every generation that sought forbidden knowledge followed in the footsteps of Nama. The echoes were not genetic memories, but spiritual possibilities that would never be fully silenced. Nama in later traditions, demon, matriarch, or both. Time has a way of changing stories, and few stories changed as dramatically as that of Nama, the beautiful daughter of Cain. What began as a simple biblical mention grew into a complex web of traditions that painted her as everything from humanity's first seductress to the secret mother of nations. The truth about Naama became less important than what people needed her to represent. The earliest post-biblical traditions were not kind to Naama. Jewish folklore transformed her from a woman into something far more dangerous. She became the mother of demons, the seductress who had corrupted the sons of God before the flood. In these stories, her beauty was a weapon, her knowledge a trap, her love a path to destruction. She was the first woman to teach men the arts of war and magic, skills that led directly to the violence that provoked God's judgment. The Zohar, that mystical Jewish text, gave Naama an even darker role. She became the wife of fallen angels, the mother of spirits that plagued humanity. According to these traditions, she did not die in the flood. Instead, she transformed into a demon who continued to seduce men and bear supernatural children. Every beautiful woman who led men astray carried something of Naama within her. Every child born of forbidden unions was her spiritual descendant. Medieval Christian traditions took these themes and ran with them. Naama became a figure of ultimate temptation, the woman whose beauty had corrupted heaven itself. Some identified her with Lilith, Adam's first wife, who had refused to submit to authority. Others saw her as the prototype for all the wicked women who appeared in Scripture: Jezebel, Gomer, the whore of Babylon. She was the original femme fatale, the woman whose allure was matched only by her danger. But other traditions told a different story entirely. Some claimed that Naama had not been a corrupter, but a victim. She had been chosen by the Watchers not because she was evil, but because she was beautiful and innocent. Her fall was not a choice, but a tragedy. These versions painted her as the first woman to suffer for men's desires, the first to pay the price for knowledge she had not sought. Islamic traditions added another layer to Naama's story. Some identified her with the Queen of Sheba, that mysterious woman who had tested Solomon's wisdom. Others suggested she was the mother of the jinn, those supernatural beings who existed between angels and humans. In these tales, she was neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but something more complex, a bridge between worlds, a being who belonged fully to neither heaven nor earth. The most surprising tradition claimed that Naama had survived the flood by becoming Noah's wife. This version suggested that her beauty and wisdom had caught the righteous man's attention, that her knowledge of the old world had made her valuable to the new one. If true, this would make her the mother of all post-flood humanity, the hidden matriarch whose blood flowed in every person born after the waters receded. This tradition solved several puzzles that had bothered scholars for centuries. It explained how certain knowledge and skills had survived the flood. It accounted for the echoes of Cain's lineage that appeared in later peoples. Most importantly, it suggested that God's judgment had been tempered with mercy, that even the most fallen could find redemption through repentance and submission. The tradition of Naama as Noah's wife also explained certain mysteries in the biblical text. The Bible mentions that Noah's sons took wives, but it never names Noah's own wife. Could this unnamed woman have been the most famous woman of her generation? Could the first lady of the New World have been the last daughter of the Old One? Renaissance scholars became fascinated with these possibilities. They saw in Nama a symbol of the complex relationship between knowledge and wisdom, between beauty and danger, between the old world and the new. She represented the eternal feminine principle that could either elevate or destroy, depending on how it was directed and received. Some artists of the period depicted Nama as a tragic figure, a woman caught between competing loyalties and desires. Others showed her as a powerful sorceress, mistress of arts that predated civilization itself. Still others painted her as a loving mother, the woman who had helped preserve humanity through its darkest hour. Each interpretation reflected the artist's own understanding of femininity, power, and redemption. Modern scholars have tried to find the historical Nama beneath these layers of tradition and interpretation. Some suggest she was a composite figure, created by combining memories of several women from Cain's lineage. Others argue that she represents a cultural memory of the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to urban civilizations, a time when women's roles and status changed dramatically. The feminist movement has reclaimed Nama as a symbol of women's strength and independence. In this reading, she was not a seductress or a victim, but a pioneer who had dared to seek knowledge and power in a world that denied both to women. Her punishment was not divine justice, but patriarchal backlash against feminine authority. Religious communities continue to grapple with Nama's legacy. Some see her as a warning about the dangers of unchecked desire and ambition. Others view her as a reminder that God's mercy extends even to those who have fallen farthest from grace. Still others find in her story a call to examine the ways that beauty, knowledge, and power interact in human relationships. What seems clear is that Nama has become more than a historical figure or even a mythological character. She has become a mirror in which each generation sees its own struggles with temptation, knowledge, and redemption. Whether demon, matriarch, or something more complex, she remains a powerful symbol of the choices that define human existence. The question of who Nama really was may be less important than who she has become. In the centuries since her supposed death in the flood, she has lived on as an idea, a possibility, a reminder of paths taken and untaken. She represents the eternal human fascination with beauty, knowledge, and the divine, and the complex consequences that follow when these forces meet in a single life. The mark of Cain, a legacy reinterpreted. The mark that God placed on Cain's forehead was meant to be a protection, a sign that warned others not to harm the first murderer. But time and human nature have a way of twisting even the most merciful gifts into something darker. The mark of Cain became one of history's most misunderstood symbols, a sign that was reinterpreted, weaponized, and feared across centuries and cultures. The original purpose was clear enough. Cain had killed his brother and feared that others would kill him in return. God's mark was an act of mercy, ensuring that the cycle of violence would not continue. It was protection, not punishment. But as Cain's descendants multiplied and spread, the mark became something else entirely. It became a symbol of separation, of difference, of being set apart from the rest of humanity. The daughters of Cain would have carried this mark, or at least the awareness of it. They lived as the children of the marked man, the descendants of the one who bore God's sign. This knowledge would have shaped their identity in ways both subtle and profound. They were beautiful, powerful, and accomplished, but they were also marked people, carrying the weight of their ancestors' crime. Early interpreters saw the mark as literal. They imagined a physical sign on Cain's skin, perhaps a letter or symbol that identified him as the first murderer. Some suggested it was a trembling in his hands, a shaking that would mark him forever as unstable and dangerous. Others proposed that it was a change in his appearance, a darkness or pallor that set him apart from other humans. Medieval scholars developed more complex theories about the mark's nature and purpose. Some argued that it was not physical at all, but spiritual. The mark represented Cain's separation from God, his exile from divine grace. It was invisible to human eyes, but clearly visible to spiritual beings. This interpretation explained how Cain could build cities and father children while still being marked as different. The most tragic reinterpretation of the mark came much later, when various groups used it to justify prejudice and oppression. Some claim that certain ethnic groups were descendants of Cain, bearing his mark through their skin color or physical features. This reading was not only wrong, but deliberately harmful, using an ancient story to support modern racism and violence. These misinterpretations ignored the fundamental nature of God's mark. It was protection, not condemnation. It was mercy, not judgment. It was a sign that even the worst sinner could receive divine grace, not proof that some people were permanently cursed. The mark was meant to prevent violence, not encourage it. The daughters of Cain lived with this complex legacy. They were part of a marked lineage, but they were also individuals with their own choices and destinies. The mark their ancestor bore did not determine their own moral standing. Nama's beauty, Ada's motherhood, Zilla's wisdom, these were their own achievements, not products of any inherited curse. Some traditions suggested that the daughters themselves bore visible marks, signs that identified them as Cain's descendants. These marks were said to be beautiful rather than frightening, drawing attention rather than repelling it. The forbidden knowledge they possessed, the arts they practiced, the unions they formed with the sons of God, all of these were connected to their marked status, their identity as the children of the different one. The flood was supposed to wash away the mark along with everything else connected to Cain's lineage. But if the mark was truly about separation from God, then it could not be removed by water alone. It required something deeper: repentance, reconciliation, redemption. The question that haunted later generations was whether this had happened, whether the mark had truly been washed away, or whether it had somehow survived. Post-flood peoples seemed to carry echoes of the mark. The Canaanites, descendants of Ham, were marked for conquest by the Israelites. The various nations that opposed God's people were seen as bearing some form of divine disapproval. The mark of Cain seemed to reappear in these later conflicts, though the connection was more symbolic than literal. The mark also appeared in unexpected places within the community of faith. David, the man after God's own heart, was marked by his sin with Bathsheba. The Israelites themselves were marked by their rebellion in the wilderness. Even the prophets bore marks of divine calling that set them apart from their communities. The mark was not always about sin. Sometimes it was about purpose. Christian interpretations of the mark evolved over time. Some saw it as prefiguring the cross, the mark that Jesus would bear for humanity's sins. Others viewed it as a symbol of original sin, the separation from God that affected all humanity. Still others found in it a sign of God's persistent love, the mark that showed divine protection even for the worst sinners. The mark raised profound questions about inheritance and identity. Did the sins of the fathers truly visit the children? Were the daughters of Cain responsible for their ancestors' crime? Could a mark be passed down through generations, or was each person marked by their own choices? These questions had no easy answers, but they shaped how people understood their own relationship with God and with each other. Modern scholars have tried to understand the mark in its original context. Some suggest it was a tattoo or scarification, common practices in ancient cultures for marking identity and status. Others propose that it was metaphorical from the beginning, a way of describing Cain's changed relationship with both God and humanity. The literal nature of the mark may be less important than its symbolic meaning. The mark of Cain continues to fascinate people today because it touches on universal themes: guilt and forgiveness, punishment and protection, identity and belonging. It raises questions about whether anyone is beyond redemption, whether divine mercy has limits, whether the past determines the future. These are questions that every generation must answer for itself. The daughters of Cain lived and died as marked people, but they also lived as individuals with their own stories and choices. The mark their ancestor bore was part of their heritage, but it was not their destiny. They created their own legacies for better and worse, and in doing so they showed that even the marked can rise above their origins or fall below them. The mark endures because it represents something deeper than any physical sign. It represents the human condition itself, flawed, fallen, but still capable of receiving divine grace. Whether carried by Cain's daughters or by anyone else, the mark is ultimately a sign of hope, a reminder that God's protection extends even to those who seem to deserve it least. The Watchers and the Daughters, Roots of Ancient Myths. The story of the Watchers and the Daughters of Cain became the seed from which grew countless myths across the ancient world. These tales of divine beings descending to earth, falling in love with mortal women, and creating hybrid offspring appeared in culture after culture, always with local variations, but always carrying the same essential themes. The forbidden union between heaven and earth became humanity's first great story, told and retold, until it shaped the very foundations of mythology itself. The Watchers were not simple angels. They were described as beings of immense knowledge and power, sent to observe humanity, but forbidden to intervene directly in human affairs. Their role was to watch, to report, to maintain the boundary between the divine and mortal realms. But when they saw the daughters of Cain, beautiful, accomplished, alluring, their resolve crumbled. They chose love over duty, desire over discipline, earth over heaven. This choice created the first great scandal of the spiritual realm. The Watchers taught humanity secrets that were meant to remain hidden. They showed women how to use cosmetics and jewelry to enhance their beauty. They taught men metallurgy and weaponry, turning plowshares into swords. They revealed the movements of the stars and the properties of plants, giving humanity knowledge that made them more like gods and less like the simple creatures they were meant to be. The children born from these unions were the Nephilim, beings of enormous size and strength who ruled the earth through fear and violence. They were neither fully divine nor fully human, but something new and dangerous. Their existence blurred the lines between heaven and earth, creating a race that belonged to neither realm but threatened both. This story found its way into cultures far from the biblical narrative. The Greeks told of titans who had ruled before the gods, beings of immense power who had to be overthrown and imprisoned. They spoke of Prometheus, who had stolen fire from heaven and given it to mortals, suffering eternal punishment for his act of rebellion and mercy. The parallels to the Watchers are unmistakable. The Mesopotamians preserved similar tales in their stories of the Apkallu, wise beings who had descended from heaven to teach humanity the arts of civilization. These fish-like creatures emerged from the sea to show mortals how to build cities, work metals, and read the stars. They were culture bringers, but their gifts came with a price: the loss of innocence, the beginning of ambition, the start of humanity's long struggle with the consequences of knowledge. Hindu traditions spoke of the Gandharvas, celestial musicians who sometimes took mortal wives and produced children of extraordinary beauty and talent. These unions were not always forbidden, but they were always complicated, creating beings who struggled to find their place between the human and divine worlds. The children of these unions often became great heroes or terrible demons, their mixed nature making them capable of both extraordinary good and extraordinary evil. The Celtic peoples told stories of the Tuatha De Danann, godlike beings who had once ruled Ireland before withdrawing to the otherworld. These beings sometimes took mortal lovers, creating bloodlines that carried traces of divine power through the generations. The children of these unions were often marked by unusual beauty, supernatural abilities, or tragic fates that reflected their mixed heritage. Norse mythology included the Aesir and Vanir, two groups of gods who sometimes interacted with mortals in ways that produced extraordinary offspring. The god Odin himself was known for his relationships with mortal women, creating heroes and kings who carried divine blood in their veins. These stories reflected the same themes as the Watcher narrative: the complicated consequences of mixing the divine and mortal realms. The patterns were consistent across cultures. Divine beings, usually male, descended to earth and formed relationships with mortal women. These unions produced children who were both blessed and cursed by their mixed nature. The divine beings often faced punishment for their transgression, while the mortal women suffered for their beauty and desirability. The children became heroes, monsters, or both, their extraordinary nature making them either saviors or destroyers of the world they inhabited. These myths served multiple purposes in ancient societies. They explained the origins of human knowledge and technology, suggesting that civilization itself was a gift from divine beings. They accounted for the existence of extraordinary individuals, heroes, kings, prophets, whose abilities seemed to exceed normal human limitations. They provided a framework for understanding the relationship between the divine and mortal realms and the consequences of trying to bridge the gap between them. The myths also reflected deep anxieties about knowledge, power, and ambition. They suggested that human progress came at a cost, that the gifts of civilization carried hidden dangers. The story of divine beings teaching forbidden arts to mortals became a way of exploring the double-edged nature of knowledge itself. Every advance in human capability brought new possibilities for both creation and destruction. The daughters of Cain fit perfectly into these mythological patterns. They were the beautiful mortals whose allure proved irresistible to divine beings. They were the recipients of forbidden knowledge, the mothers of extraordinary children, the catalysts for events that would reshape the world. Their story became the template for countless later tales of divine mortal romance and its consequences. The flood that supposedly ended their lineage also ended the age of direct divine mortal interaction. The myths suggest that after this great catastrophe, the barriers between heaven and earth became stronger, the possibilities for such unions more limited. The gods withdrew to their own realms, leaving humanity to work out its destiny with only occasional divine intervention. But the memory of what had been possible remained. The myths kept alive the dream of divine connection, the possibility of transcending human limitations through contact with higher powers. They also preserved the warning that such contact came with costs, that the pursuit of godlike knowledge and power could lead to destruction rather than elevation. The story of the Watchers and the daughters of Cain became more than history or mythology. It became a lens through which humanity understood its own nature and destiny. It suggested that mortals were meant to be more than animals but less than gods, occupying a unique position in the cosmos that carried both great potential and great responsibility. These ancient myths continue to resonate today because they address questions that remain relevant. What are the limits of human knowledge? What is the price of progress? How do we balance the desire for transcendence with the need for humility? The Watchers and the Daughters faced these questions first, and their story became the foundation for every later exploration of these eternal themes. The sons of Seth, the opposing line. While the daughters of Cain danced with angels and built cities that reached toward heaven, another lineage grew quietly in the shadow of their achievements. The sons of Seth walked a different path, one marked by humble worship rather than proud ambition, by submission to divine will rather than rebellion against it. Their story was less dramatic, but perhaps more important, for they carried the seed of righteousness through a world increasingly dominated by violence and corruption. Seth himself was born into grief. His parents, Adam and Eve, had lost their first two sons to murder and exile. When Seth arrived, Eve declared him a replacement for Abel, a new beginning after the tragedy that had torn their family apart. His very name meant appointed or substituted, marking him from birth as the one who would carry forward the hope that had seemed lost with Abel's death. The sons of Seth approached the divine differently than their cousins in Cain's line. Where Cain's descendants sought to master the world through knowledge and technology, Seth's children sought to know God through worship and obedience. They built altars instead of cities, offered sacrifices instead of creating monuments to their own achievements. Their legacy was written not in bronze and stone, but in the quiet faithfulness of generations who chose to walk with their Creator. The contrast between the two lines grew more pronounced with each passing generation. While Cain's daughters adorned themselves with jewelry and cosmetics taught by fallen angels, Seth's daughters covered themselves with modesty and virtue. While Cain's sons forged weapons and built walls, Seth's sons tended flocks and tilled the ground with simple tools. The difference was not in capability, but in orientation. One line looked to itself for salvation, the other looked to God. Enosh, Seth's son, marked a turning point in human history. His name meant mortal or frail, a reminder of human weakness and dependence on divine grace. During his lifetime, people began to call upon the name of the Lord in organized public worship. This was not the private communion that Adam and Eve had known in Eden, nor the fearful acknowledgement that Cain had offered after his crime. This was something new: communal worship, collective recognition of human need for divine guidance. The sons of Seth developed a culture of remembrance. They told stories of Eden, of the fall, of the promise that one day a descendant of Eve would crush the serpent's head. These were not exciting tales of adventure and conquest like those told in Cain's cities. They were quieter stories, centered on relationship with God rather than human achievement. They preserved the memory of what humanity had lost and the hope of what might be restored. Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared. The names of Seth's line carry meanings that reflect their spiritual orientation. Canaan means possession or acquisition, but not in the sense of material wealth. It suggested that these people saw themselves as God's possession, acquired by divine love rather than their own effort. Mahalalel means praise of God, marking a generation that found its identity in worship rather than in worldly accomplishment. The sons of Seth remained shepherds and farmers long after Cain's descendants had moved to cities. This was not due to lack of ability or ambition, but because they found meaning in simpler pursuits. They saw the hand of God in the growth of their flocks, in the harvest of their fields, in the changing of the seasons. They did not need to build monuments to their own greatness, because they found their greatness in their relationship with the eternal. Jared's son Enoch represented the pinnacle of Seth's line. While his namesake in Cain's lineage had a city built in his honor, this Enoch built something more lasting, a life so pleasing to God that he was taken up without experiencing death. Enoch walked with God in a way that had not been seen since Eden. He received visions of the future, prophecies of judgment and redemption, knowledge that came not from fallen angels, but from the throne of heaven itself. The contrast between the two Enochs could not have been more striking. One was honored with a city that would crumble with time, the other with a translation that would last forever. One represented human achievement at its peak, the other represented human relationship with God at its deepest. The city of Enoch showcased what mortals could build when they set their minds to it. The walking of Enoch showed what mortals could become when they set their hearts on God. Enoch's prophecies spoke directly to the situation developing around him. He saw the corruption spreading through the earth as the sons of God took wives from among the daughters of men. He witnessed the birth of the Nephilim and the violence they brought to the world. He understood that judgment was coming, that God's patience with human rebellion had limits. His warnings were not heeded by the majority, but they were preserved by the faithful remnant of Seth's line. Methuselah, Enoch's son, lived longer than any human before or since. His 969 years spanned the entire period from Enoch's translation to the flood itself. Some traditions suggest that his name means when he dies, it will come, referring to the judgment that would follow his death. Whether this is true or not, Methuselah served as a living bridge between the age of the fathers and the age of judgment, a reminder that God's mercy extends even as his justice approaches. The sons of Seth maintained their distinctive identity even as the world around them grew more corrupt. They continued to offer sacrifices, to call upon God's name, to live according to divine principles rather than human desires. But the pressure to conform to the ways of Cain's descendants was constant. The daughters of Cain were beautiful, accomplished, and alluring. The cities they built offered comfort and culture that the simple life of Seth's line could not match. Gradually, the distinction between the two lines began to blur. The sons of God, as Seth's descendants were called, began to notice the daughters of men, as Cain's line was known. The forbidden became attractive, the separate became mixed, the holy became common. This was not a sudden fall, but a gradual drift, a slow compromise that seemed reasonable at each step, but led ultimately to catastrophe. Lamech of Seth's line named his son Noah with the hope that this child would bring comfort from the curse that had fallen upon the ground. The name itself meant rest or comfort, reflecting the weariness that even the righteous felt as they watched the world sink deeper into corruption. Noah represented the last hope of Seth's line, the final opportunity for humanity to return to the path of righteousness before judgment fell. The sons of Seth had preserved the memory of what humanity was meant to be. In their simple worship, their faithful service, their patient waiting for God's redemption, they carried forward the seed of righteousness that had been planted in Eden. They were not perfect. The Bible makes clear that Noah was righteous in his generation, not absolutely righteous, but they were faithful. They remembered their Creator when others forgot. They worshiped when others rebelled. They hoped when others despaired. The tragedy of the pre-flood world was not just that Cain's line fell into corruption, but that Seth's line failed to remain separate. The daughters of Cain were beautiful, but the sons of Seth were meant to find their beauty in relationship with God. The cities of Cain were impressive, but the sons of Seth were meant to find their security in divine protection. The knowledge of Cain's descendants was extensive, but the sons of Seth were meant to find their wisdom in the fear of the Lord. When the flood came, only Noah and his family survived from Seth's line. They carried with them not just the human race, but the memory of what it meant to walk with God. The new world that emerged from the waters would face the same choices that had confronted the sons of Seth and the daughters of Cain. The same temptations, the same opportunities, the same fundamental decision between submission and rebellion would present themselves again and again. The sons of Seth remind us that there is always an alternative to the path of prideful achievement. There is always the option of humble worship, of faithful service, of patient waiting for God's timing. Their story is less dramatic than that of Cain's daughters, but it is no less important. They show us that the quiet path of righteousness, though it may seem less exciting than the broad road of rebellion, leads ultimately to life rather than death, to blessing rather than judgment, to the presence of God rather than exile from his face. Echoes in modern religion, the Cainite archetype. The daughters of Cain did not disappear when the floodwaters receded. They lived on in the religious imagination of humanity, becoming archetypes that shaped how people understood the relationship between divine and human, between knowledge and wisdom, between beauty and danger. Their story became a template that religious thinkers would use to interpret the spiritual struggles of every generation. Early Christian writers saw in the daughters of Cain a warning about the seductive power of worldly beauty and achievement. They represented the temptation to seek fulfillment through material success rather than spiritual devotion. The Church Fathers used their story to encourage believers to resist the allure of secular culture, to choose the narrow path of righteousness over the broad road of worldly success. Augustine, the great theologian of the early church, wrote extensively about the two cities, the city of God and the city of man. In his understanding, Cain's city of Enoch represented the earthly city, built on human pride and ambition. Seth's line represented the heavenly city, just built on love for God and neighbor. The daughters of Cain were citizens of the earthly city, beautiful and accomplished, but ultimately focused on temporal rather than eternal values. The Gnostic traditions, which the early church rejected as heretical, took a different approach to the daughters of Cain. Some Gnostic texts portrayed them as carriers of divine knowledge, rebels against an oppressive cosmic order, rather than examples of human rebellion against divine authority. In these traditions, the forbidden knowledge they received from the Watchers was actually liberating truth, hidden from humanity by jealous spiritual powers. Medieval Christianity developed complex allegories around the daughters of Cain. They became symbols of the human soul's struggle between virtue and vice, between the call to holiness and the attraction of sin. The beauty that had enchanted the Watchers represented the seductive power of temptation itself. Their ultimate destruction in the flood served as a reminder that no earthly beauty or achievement could survive divine judgment. The Renaissance brought new interpretations of the Cainite legacy. Humanist scholars were fascinated by the idea of humans receiving divine knowledge, seeing in the daughters of Cain early examples of human potential for learning and achievement. Some viewed them as tragic figures, punished for seeking knowledge that was rightfully theirs. Others saw them as pioneers of human civilization, whose contributions had been unfairly demonized by religious tradition. The Protestant Reformation brought renewed focus on the doctrine of original sin and human depravity. Reformed theologians use the story of Cain's daughters to illustrate humanity's tendency toward rebellion and corruption. They were examples of how even the most gifted and beautiful humans could fall into sin when they turned away from God's will. Their story reinforced the need for divine grace and the danger of trusting in human achievement. The Enlightenment saw a dramatic shift in how the daughters of Cain were interpreted. Rationalist thinkers began to see them as symbols of human progress and the pursuit of knowledge. The forbidden arts they had received from the Watchers were reinterpreted as the foundations of science, technology, and civilization. Rather than being punished for their rebellion, they were seen as martyrs for human advancement, destroyed by religious superstition rather than divine judgment. Romantic literature of the 18th and 19th centuries embraced the tragic beauty of the daughters of Cain. They became archetypal figures of the beautiful woman destroyed by forces beyond her control. Byron, Shelley, and other Romantic poets saw in them symbols of the human spirit's struggle against cosmic injustice. Their rebellion against divine authority was reframed as a noble quest for freedom and self-determination. The 20th century brought psychological interpretations of the Cainite archetype. Jungian analysts saw in the daughters of Cain representations of the anima, the feminine aspect of the human psyche. Their attraction to forbidden knowledge represented the soul's deep desire for wholeness and integration. Their destruction in the flood symbolized the danger of repressing rather than integrating the shadow aspects of personality. Feminist theology has reclaimed the daughters of Cain as symbols of women's struggle for equality and recognition. In this reading, they were not seductresses or rebels, but women who dared to seek knowledge and power in a patriarchal world. Their punishment was not divine justice, but masculine fear of feminine strength. Their beauty and accomplishments were gifts to be celebrated rather than dangers to be feared. Liberation theology has found in the daughters of Cain examples of the oppressed seeking justice and empowerment. Their pursuit of forbidden knowledge represents the legitimate desire of marginalized peoples to escape the limitations imposed by unjust systems. Their destruction in the flood symbolizes the way that powerful interests destroy those who challenge the status quo. New Age spirituality has embraced the daughters of Cain as symbols of the divine feminine principle. They represent the ancient wisdom that was suppressed by patriarchal religion, but is now being recovered and celebrated. Their union with the Watchers symbolizes the marriage of heaven and earth, the integration of spiritual and material reality that New Age practitioners seek to achieve. Contemporary evangelical Christianity continues to use the daughters of Cain as warnings about the dangers of secular culture and worldly success. They represent the temptation to value beauty, achievement, and knowledge over relationship with God. Their story is used to encourage believers to maintain their distinctiveness from the surrounding culture, to resist the seductive power of worldly values. The daughters of Cain have also found new life in popular culture. They appear in novels, films, and television shows as archetypal figures of dangerous beauty and forbidden knowledge. Their story has been adapted and reinterpreted countless times, each version reflecting the concerns and values of its particular time and place. What remains constant across all these interpretations is the recognition that the daughters of Cain represent something fundamental about the human condition. They embody the tension between submission and rebellion, between accepting limits and pushing beyond them, between finding meaning in relationship with the divine and seeking fulfillment through human achievement. Their story continues to resonate because these tensions are eternal features of human existence. The daughters of Cain have become more than historical figures or mythological characters. They have become symbols of the choices that every generation must make, the paths that every individual must choose between. Whether they are seen as warnings or inspirations, as villains or heroes, they continue to shape how humanity understands its own spiritual journey. Their legacy in modern religion is not just about the past, but about the present and future. They represent possibilities that remain open, choices that must still be made, tensions that continue to define the human experience. In this sense, the daughters of Cain are not ancient history, but contemporary reality, as relevant to the spiritual struggles of the 21st century as they were to those of the ancient world. Cultural shadows, Cain's legacy in literature and art. The daughters of Cain cast long shadows across human culture, their images appearing in literature and art whenever creators sought to explore themes of beauty, knowledge, rebellion, and divine judgment. Their story became a wellspring of inspiration for artists who found in their tale the perfect embodiment of humanity's complex relationship with power, wisdom, and the divine. Medieval illuminated manuscripts first gave visual form to the daughters of Cain, though their depictions were often more symbolic than realistic. These early artists portrayed them as beautiful but dangerous women, their faces serene but their eyes holding hints of the forbidden knowledge they possessed. Uh, the manuscripts often showed them in moments of instruction, receiving wisdom from the watchers, or in scenes of domestic life that emphasized their role as mothers of a cursed lineage. Renaissance painters discovered in the daughters of Cain subjects that allowed them to explore the tension between sacred and secular art. They could paint beautiful women and justify it as religious instruction. Nama, in particular, became a favorite subject, her legendary beauty providing an excuse for artists to create works that celebrated physical perfection while ostensibly warning against its dangers. These paintings often showed her as a figure of tragic beauty, her face reflecting both her allure and her ultimate fate. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries embraced the daughters of Cain as symbols of the beautiful soul destroyed by cosmic injustice. Poets like Byron and Shelley saw in them kindred spirits, rebels against divine authority who paid the ultimate price for their independence. Their works transformed the daughters from cautionary tales into tragic heroes, noble in their defiance even as they faced inevitable destruction. William Blake's mystical poetry and art gave the daughters of Cain new life as symbols of the creative imagination. In Blake's mythology, they represented the artistic spirit that dared to challenge conventional wisdom and create new forms of beauty. Their union with the Watchers symbolized the marriage of inspiration and technique, the divine spark that ignites human creativity. Their destruction in the flood represented the way that conventional society destroys those who dare to think and create differently. Gothic literature of the 19th century found in the daughters of Cain perfect subjects for exploring themes of forbidden knowledge and dangerous beauty. They appeared in novels as mysterious women who possessed ancient wisdom and supernatural power. Their beauty was always described as otherworldly, too perfect to be entirely human. Their knowledge was always dangerous, leading those who sought it to destruction or madness. The pre-Raphaelite painters of Victorian England were particularly drawn to the daughters of Cain as subjects. These artists sought to recover the spiritual intensity of medieval art while embracing the sensual beauty of Renaissance painting. The daughters provided the perfect synthesis, beautiful women whose stories carried deep spiritual meaning. Paintings like Dante Gabriel Rossetti's depictions of fatal women drew heavily on the archetype of Cain's daughters, even when they portrayed other subjects. Symbolist poets and artists of the late 19th century saw in the daughters of Cain representations of the soul's quest for forbidden knowledge. They became symbols of the artistic imagination that dared to explore realms that conventional society deemed dangerous or immoral. Their beauty represented the aesthetic ideal, while their destruction represented the price that artists paid for their dedication to truth and beauty. The 20th century brought new interpretations of the daughters of Cain in literature and art. Modernist writers like James Joyce and T.S. Eliot used them as symbols of the fragmentation of modern consciousness, the loss of innocence that marked the modern age. Their story provided a mythological framework for understanding the spiritual crisis of the contemporary world. Feminist artists and writers reclaimed the daughters of Cain as symbols of women's struggle for equality and recognition. They were reinterpreted as pioneers who had dared to seek knowledge and power in a world that denied both to women. Their beauty was no longer seen as dangerous, but as powerful. Their knowledge not forbidden, but necessary. Their destruction was not divine justice, but patriarchal oppression. Contemporary fantasy literature has embraced the daughters of Cain as archetypal figures of the wise woman, the sorceress who possesses ancient knowledge and magical power. They appear in novels as mentors, antagonists, and complex characters who embody the ambiguous relationship between knowledge and wisdom, power and responsibility. Their stories provide rich material for exploring contemporary concerns about technology, gender roles, and spiritual meaning. Visual artists continue to find inspiration in the daughters of Cain. Their images appear in paintings, sculptures, and digital art that explores themes of beauty, knowledge, and rebellion. Contemporary artists often emphasize their strength and independence rather than their supposed corruption, seeing in them examples of women who refuse to be limited by conventional expectations. The Daughters of Cain have also influenced popular culture in ways both obvious and subtle. They appear in films, television shows, and video games as archetypal figures of dangerous beauty and forbidden knowledge. Their story provides a template for understanding the femme fatale, the wise woman, the rebel who challenges authority and pays the price for her independence. Music has been particularly influenced by the Daughters of Cain. Composers from Bach to contemporary artists have found in their story rich material for exploring themes of temptation, beauty, and divine judgment. Their tale has inspired operas, symphonies, and popular songs that capture the tragic beauty of their story and its contemporary relevance. The influence of the Daughters of Cain on literature and art extends beyond direct references to their story. They have become archetypal figures that shape how creators approach themes of beauty, knowledge, rebellion, and divine judgment. Their story provides a template for understanding the complex relationship between human ambition and divine authority, between the desire for knowledge and the need for wisdom. What makes the Daughters of Cain particularly powerful as artistic subjects is their embodiment of contradiction. They are beautiful but dangerous, wise but foolish, powerful but ultimately powerless. They represent the human condition in all its complexity, the tension between what we desire and what we need, between what we can achieve and what we should attempt. Their legacy in literature and art is not just about the past, but about the present and future. They continue to inspire creators who seek to explore the eternal themes that they represent. Their story provides a framework for understanding the spiritual and moral challenges of contemporary life, the choices that define human existence, the consequences of our deepest desires and highest aspirations. The Daughters of Cain have become more than characters in an ancient story. They have become symbols of the human spirit itself, with all its beauty and danger, its wisdom and folly, its power and vulnerability. They remind us that the choice between submission and rebellion, between accepting limits and pushing beyond them, between finding meaning in relationship with the divine and seeking fulfillment through human achievement, is one that every generation must make anew. The lineage that fell. The story ends where it began, with a choice. The daughters of Cain, beautiful and brilliant, stood at the crossroads of human destiny and chose their path. They reached for knowledge that was forbidden, embraced power that was dangerous, and loved beings that were beyond their reach. Their choice shaped not just their own fate, but the fate of the entire world. We have walked with them through their rise and fall, from the building of the first city to the waters of the flood. We have seen how their beauty enchanted angels and how their wisdom shaped civilization. We have watched them teach their children the arts of war and peace, of creation and destruction. We have witnessed their final moments as the waters rose and their lineage disappeared beneath the waves. But their story did not end with the flood. It lived on in the myths and legends of every culture that followed. It shaped how humanity understood the relationship between divine and mortal, between knowledge and wisdom, between beauty and danger. The daughters of Cain became more than historical figures. They became symbols of the eternal human struggle between submission and rebellion, between accepting our place in the cosmic order and trying to transcend it. Their legacy is written in every city that reaches toward heaven, in every person who seeks forbidden knowledge, in every heart that chooses pride over humility. It appears in the beauty that enchants and destroys, in the wisdom that elevates and corrupts, in the love that creates and condemns. The daughters of Cain walk among us still, not as flesh and blood, but as possibilities, as choices, as warnings, as inspirations. They remind us that humanity has always stood at the crossroads between two paths, One path leads toward relationship with the divine, toward humble submission to cosmic order, toward finding meaning in our proper place within creation. The other path leads toward independence from divine authority, toward the pursuit of knowledge and power without regard for their proper use, toward the attempt to become gods ourselves. The daughters of Cain chose the second path, and their choice brought both wonders and terrors to the world. They gave humanity the gifts of civilization, cities and technology, art and music, knowledge and power. But they also gave humanity the curse of ambition, the desire to transcend our limits, to know what we should not know, to love what we should not love. Their story is ultimately about the price of knowledge and the cost of beauty. It asks whether there are some things that should remain hidden, some boundaries that should not be crossed, some loves that should not be pursued. It suggests that the greatest gifts can become the greatest curses when they are used without wisdom, when they lead us away from rather than toward our Creator. The flood that ended their lineage was meant to be a new beginning, a chance for humanity to start fresh with the lessons of the past, clearly in mind. But the echoes of their story suggest that the same choices, the same temptations, the same possibilities for both creation and destruction would arise again and again in every generation. Noah's family carried the future of humanity in their genes, but they also carried the memory of what had come before. The daughters of Cain were gone, but the questions they had raised remained. How do we balance the desire for knowledge with the need for wisdom? How do we pursue beauty without being destroyed by it? How do we create without becoming consumed by pride in our creations? These questions have no easy answers because they touch on the fundamental nature of human existence. We are creatures made in the image of God, but we are also fallen beings who struggle with the same temptations that destroyed the daughters of Cain. We are capable of great beauty and great wisdom, but we are also capable of great folly and great destruction. The daughters of Cain teach us that the choice between these possibilities is always before us. We can choose to use our gifts in service of others and in submission to divine wisdom, or we can choose to use them in service of ourselves and in rebellion against cosmic order. We can choose to find our beauty in relationship with our Creator, or we can choose to find it in the admiration of others. We can choose to seek knowledge that leads to wisdom, or we can choose to seek knowledge that leads to power. Their story suggests that the stakes of these choices are higher than we might think. The daughters of Cain were not destroyed because they were beautiful or because they were wise. They were destroyed because they used their beauty and wisdom in ways that led to corruption and violence. They became so focused on their own achievements that they forgot their dependence on the one who had given them the ability to achieve. The lineage that fell was not just a genetic line, but a spiritual line, a way of thinking and living that put human achievement above divine relationship. That lineage did not disappear with the flood. It lives on in every heart that chooses pride over humility, in every mind that seeks knowledge without wisdom, in every soul that pursues beauty without love. But the story also suggests that redemption is always possible. The mark of Cain was meant to be protection, not condemnation. The judgment of the flood was preceded by centuries of patience and warning. Even the daughters of Cain, in their final moments, may have found grace in their Creator's eyes. The story of their fall is also a story of divine mercy, of a God who does not desire the destruction of the wicked, but their repentance and restoration. We are all daughters and sons of Cain in the sense that we all carry the capacity for both creation and destruction, for both beauty and corruption, for both wisdom and folly. The question is not whether we will face the same choices that they faced, but how we will respond when we do. Will we choose the path of humble submission or prideful rebellion? Will we use our gifts to serve others or to serve ourselves? Will we seek knowledge that leads to wisdom or knowledge that leads to power? The lineage that fell reminds us that these choices matter, that they have consequences not just for us, but for the world around us. The daughters of Cain shaped their world through their choices, and we shape ours through ours. Their story is our story. Their choices are our choices. Their legacy is our legacy. In the end, the daughters of Cain teach us that the most important thing is not how beautiful we are, or how much we know, or how much we achieve. The most important thing is how we relate to the one who gave us our beauty, our knowledge, and our ability to achieve. The lineage that fell was not destroyed by divine anger, but by divine justice, not by hatred, but by love, not by caprice, but by the inexorable logic of choices and consequences. Their story ends with water, but it also ends with hope. The flood that destroyed them also cleansed the earth, preparing it for a new beginning. The ark that floated above their graves carried the promise of a better future, a world where the lessons of the past would be remembered and the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. The daughters of Cain have passed into legend, but their story remains as relevant today as it was in the beginning. They remind us that we are not the measure of all things, that there are limits to human achievement, that the greatest beauty and the deepest wisdom are found not in rebellion against our Creator, but in relationship with Him. They show us that the lineage that fell was not just theirs, but ours, and that the choice between falling and rising is one that we must make every day.